They stand in silence, rooted and unmoving. Yet beneath that stillness lies a world of secret intelligence. Plants breathe, listen, communicate, and even remember living networks that shape the air we breathe and the future of every living thing. From forests that speak through underground webs to flowers that deceive with scent and light, the plant world is not passive, but alive with hidden purpose. In this journey through the unseen mind of nature, we'll uncover how leaves make electricity, how trees share memory, and how ancient roots still pulse with time itself. What if the planet's truest consciousness has been watching us all along, quiet, patient, and green? If you walk into a forest at dawn, before the birds begin to stir, and before the sunlight has found its way through the leaves, there is a strange stillness that feels alive. The air itself seems to move differently, as if something vast is breathing just beneath the quiet. You might not hear it, and yet every leaf, every blade of moss, and every slender vine is drawing in and giving out, taking in carbon from your own breath and sending back oxygen in return. It is an ancient exchange older than any language, a rhythm that never stops, even when the world forgets to listen. When we breathe, the forest breathes with us, and in that unseen connection lies the quiet machinery of life itself, hidden within the smallest cells of every green leaf are tiny structures called chloroplasts, and inside them is the pigment chlorophyll, which traps the light of the sun the way a hand catches a falling coin. It is here that the first transformation happens. The light becomes sugar, the air becomes food, and energy becomes motion. This process, which we now call photosynthesis, began more than 3 billion years ago with simple blue-green bacteria that floated in ancient seas. Through their invisible work, they changed the very composition of the planet's atmosphere, filling it with oxygen and giving breath to creatures that did not yet exist. Long before the first forest, before even the first tree, there was already a whisper of green preparing the world for life as we know it. By the time the first forests appeared, about 385 million years ago, the Earth's surface was still rough and new. The Devonian age brought the rise of trees with true roots and leaves. Like Archaeopteryx, which towered over ferns and mosses and began to bind soil together, shaping landscapes for the first time, scientists studying ancient rock formations have found fossilized spores and leaf imprints from that era, showing how plant life spread from shorelines into the heart of continents. These early forests were the first lungs of the planet, drawing in carbon dioxide and releasing the oxygen that allowed animals to grow larger and breathe deeper. Every forest since then has carried that legacy, a slow, constant cycle that never needed an engine or a spark only. Sunlight and patience. If you were to stand inside a forest and look at the patterns of light filtering through branches, you would notice how the air seems cooler and the sounds softer. That is because plants are not only shaping gases, but also temperature and moisture. As they breathe, they release tiny droplets of water through openings on their leaves called stomata, creating invisible clouds of humidity that rise and drift, forming part of the local weather. In tropical forests like the Amazon, this process is so powerful that it generates its own rain, recycling moisture through the canopy and back into the sky. In 2019, researchers at the University of São Paulo recorded how the forest's daily rhythm of water vapor could even be measured from orbiting satellites. Like a slow pulse seen from space, even when night falls and the forest darkens, the exchange does not end, only changes direction. Without sunlight, photosynthesis pauses and plants draw in oxygen instead, burning the sugars they made during the day to stay alive. This balance between giving and taking, between day and night, forms a complete breath that mirrors our own inhaling and exhaling. For every step we take, for every breath we draw, there is a counter-breath rising from the forest floor, a delicate reciprocity that has existed for millions of years. Yet this rhythm is not uniform. Different forests breathe at different speeds. A pine forest in winter exhales slowly, each needle coated with frost that dulls the process, while a tropical mangrove in summer breathes quickly, its roots drinking from saltwater tides. Scientists measuring carbon flux use tall metal towers rising above the treetops, to study how oxygen and carbon dioxide move through air, mapping the invisible tide of respiration across hours and seasons. One of the longest-running studies, begun in the 1990s at Harvard Forest in Massachusetts, has shown how even small changes in temperature alter this balance. As trees breathe faster in warmth and slower in cold, adjusting like living clocks, to the pace of the planet's climate, if you could listen to this exchange not with ears, but with instruments fine enough to detect, it would hear a soft chorus of chemistry. Molecules moving between leaves and air, sugars rising through stems, and roots exhaling carbon deep below the soil. The forest is not silent at all. It is filled with quiet motion, with countless tiny acts that together create the atmosphere that sustains us. When we burn fuel or cut trees, we interrupt that rhythm, speeding the inhale and thinning the exhale. But still, the forest tries to balance itself, to breathe back what it can. It is humbling to think that every breath a human takes contains atoms that once belonged to a leaf or a blade of grass, that the air filling our lungs may have passed through the heart of a redwood or a fern in some far century. This is the true continuity of life, not lineage or memory, but breath shared. Across time, the forests do not need to speak for us to understand that we belong to their breathing, just as they belong to ours. In the hush of dawn, when the air tastes clean and the mist still clings to branches, it is possible to feel this exchange as something almost sacred. It is not metaphor, but fact, not poetry, but science, wearing the calm face of wonder. And so, when we look at the forest, we are not looking at scenery or background, but at the very act of living, stretched across 1,000 forms. Every rustling leaf, every soft drift of air, every shaft of light through the canopy is part of a single, fast inhalation that began long before us and will continue long after. The forest breathes, and in the space between that breath and ours, the planet keeps its rhythm, beneath the ground where we walk. Under the carpet of fallen leaves and moss lies another world that rarely sees the light. It is a place of threads and silence, where roots and fungi weave together into something older and more connected than any city built above. Most of us imagine a tree as a single being trunk, branches and leaves, but what truly keeps it alive exists out of sight in the dark soil where it speaks without words. Through a vast web of fungal filaments known as mycorrhizae, trees and plants form living partnerships, trading food, water, and even warnings through chemical signals. Each thread is thinner than a hair, yet together they stretch for miles beneath. Forests, linking roots in quiet cooperation. The ground, though it appears solid, is full of movement, minerals flowing, sugars traveling, and messages passing from one living thing to another. For centuries, this network went unnoticed. Botanists in the 19th century studied plants mainly by what they could see above ground: the leaves, no flowers, the seeds, believing the soil was merely an anchor, a place to draw nutrients and water. But beginning in the late 20th century, a few scientists started to question that view. Among them was Suzanne Simard, a Canadian ecologist born in 1960 in British Columbia, who grew up surrounded by the dense forests of the Monashee Mountains. In the 1990s, while working for the British Columbia Ministry of Forests, Simard began to notice that clear-cutting old forests and replanting with single species of trees often led to failure. The young trees would wither, their growth stunted even though the soil seemed fertile. She wondered if the missing ingredient was not chemical but social, something invisible lost when the older trees were gone. In 1997, after years of experiments involving carbon tracers and root mapping, Simard published a groundbreaking paper showing that trees communicate underground through fungal networks. By tagging certain trees with carbon isotopes and tracking how that carbon moved through the soil, she proved that birch and fir trees could exchange nutrients through shared fungal partners, feeding each other depending on the season. When the birch had full summer leaves, it passed sugars to shaded firs. In autumn, when the birch shed its leaves, the fir returned the favor. What seemed like competition was, in truth, cooperation on a scale far deeper than anyone had imagined. Simard also discovered that within these systems, certain large trees, what she called mother trees, acted as central hubs, distributing resources and information across vast distances. Their roots were connected to hundreds of smaller trees, and when those young saplings struggled in the shade, the mother trees sent them carbon, nitrogen, and even defensive compounds that helped them resist disease. In one experiment, when simmered cut down the mother trees, the survival rate of surrounding seedlings fell sharply, as if the entire forest had lost its nervous system. The discovery rewrote the story of forests. Instead of isolated individuals competing for sunlight, we saw a collective organism built on sharing memory, resilience. Beneath every step we take in such a forest, this exchange is happening continually. Fungal strands called hyphae stretch outward from roots, joining others and forming what scientists now call the wood wide web. Through these connections, trees can warn each other of danger, such as insect attacks or drought. In one well-known study from 2010, researchers observed that when certain trees were infested with aphids, they released chemical signals into the network that triggered nearby trees to increase their defensive compounds before the insects arrived. It was as if the forest possessed a primitive sense of awareness, slow, chemical, and yet undeniably real. The partnership between trees and fungi is ancient, likely dating back over 400 million years to when the first plants began colonizing land. Fossilized roots from the Devonian period showed traces of these fungal connections, suggesting that plants and fungi evolved together, each depending on the other for survival. The fungi cannot make their own food, so they take sugars from plant roots, while in return, they provide the plants with phosphorus, nitrogen, and water drawn from deep layers of soil that roots alone could not reach. This delicate balance sustains not just forests, but grasslands, crops, and gardens around the world. Without it, most plant life on Earth would wither, and the air itself would thin. For these underground conversations support the green skin that feeds us all. What is striking is how much intelligence this hidden web seems to show without thought. There are no brains, no nerves, no eyes or ears, yet patterns emerge that resemble memory and choice. When one path in the network is blocked, the flow redirects along others, maintaining connection. When nutrients are scarce, the system allocates them where they are most needed, favoring young trees or shaded plants. To human eyes, it may seem mechanical, but the rhythm feels alive. The steady heartbeat of the earth itself, standing in a forest that is hundreds of years old. You might notice how peaceful it feels, as if time moves slower there. Part of that stillness comes from what is happening beneath. The invisible labor of roots and fungi keeping every living thing balanced. The forest floor may appear silent, yet it hums with chemical messages, moving from one end to the other, linking birches, firs, cedars, and even the smallest flowers. When one tree falls, its roots decay, but its carbon remains in the soil. It's feeding others, becoming part of the continuous underground pulse. Scientists mapping these interactions have found that the patterns of connectivity resemble neural networks. In the human brain, dense, adaptable, and full of feedback loops. If we could see it with our eyes, the sight would be breathtaking. Golden threads stretching across the darkness, pulsing faintly with the exchange of energy and information, would look less like roots and more like constellation stars beneath the soil instead of above it. And perhaps, in a sense, it is our planet's own version of that, a cosmos turned inward, where every spark of life connects to another through the patient language of chemistry. The next time you stand beneath a tree, remember that its roots are not alone. They're touching, sensing, remembering, and feeding the life around them. The forest is not just a collection of trees, it is a single living fabric, growing and breathing through the ground beneath our feet. What we walk upon is not dirt or dust, but a conversation millions of years in the making, one that continues even as we stand quietly above it, unaware that the earth itself is speaking in a tongue too slow for us to hear. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the air feels still and the world holds its breath, plants are already awake in their own way. Though they do not move in ways our eyes can easily see or make sounds our ears can easily hear, they are far from silent. The life of a plant is filled with motion and response, though it happens in a slower language, one made not of words, but of vibrations, waves, and the faint trembling of cells. Scientists have long known that plants bend toward sunlight and curl around supports. Yet in the last few decades, research has begun to suggest something even more mysterious: that plants may, in fact, sense the world not only through light and touch, but also through sound. The idea seems poetic, almost fanciful, yet evidence continues to grow, whispering that the green world around us is far more aware than we once believed. For most of human history, sound was thought to belong solely to creatures that breathe and move, to birds singing in branches or insects droning through grass. But plants to live in a sea of vibration. Every gust of wind, every footstep, every drop of rain sends small tremors through the air and the soil. Within the tissues of plants are sensitive structures that respond to such movement. Their cells stretch and contract under pressure. Their membranes shift, and chemical signals flow in response. It was Charles Darwin, more than a century ago, who first wrote that plants could sense their surroundings with what he called a root brain, capable of responding to direction and stimulus. Modern researchers have simply extended that question into the unseen range of vibration, the music of growth that plays beneath our notice. One of the leading voices in this strange field is Dr. Monica Gagliano, an evolutionary ecologist from Italy who began studying plant acoustics in the early 2010s. Her experiments startled both the scientific and philosophical communities, because they seemed to suggest that plants could not only sense vibration, but also react to specific frequencies, as if recognizing sound itself. Working with the roots of young corn plants, Gagliano observed that they consistently grew toward the source of a faint clicking noise, even when no light or chemical cues were present. The sound she used was around 220 hertz, roughly the same pitch as a human voice when softly humming, and the roots seemed drawn to it, bending gently in its direction as though following a whisper. In other trials, when sound was removed, their growth became aimless again, suggesting that the noise provided orientation. In 2013, she expanded her studies to pea plants. Using a simple Y-shaped maze where the seedlings could grow down one of two tubes, tube led to a small fan creating vibrations similar to wind, and the other led to silence. Exposure: the plants began to learn the association when the sound of the fan played. Even without wind, they grew toward it, as if anticipating the coming air. Gagliano called it associative learning, the same kind of response animals show when trained to expect food after a signal. To many, the claim was startling, even uncomfortable, because it suggested a kind of awareness operating without neurons, or consciousness, something that blurred the boundary between life and perception. Of course, the idea of plants reacting to sound is not entirely new. Farmers and gardeners have long spoken of crops that seem to thrive when spoken to or when music is played nearby. In the 1970s, experiments at the University of Ottawa and later at Annamalai University in India explored this idea, finding that certain frequencies, particularly low classical tones and rhythmic vibrations, appeared to stimulate faster germination and thicker stems in plants like wheat and rice. Though many dismiss these results as anecdotal or unrepeatable, the notion persisted, supported by new studies in acoustics and molecular biology. It is now known that mechanical vibrations can influence the opening of ion channels in plant cells, altering how nutrients and hormones move. A gentle rustle of sound, it seems, is not merely noise but a form of contact. In nature, these vibrations are constant. The wind hums across leaves, rain patters on bark, bees buzz between blossoms, and even the pull of distant thunder travels through air and ground. Plants live surrounded by this chorus. Some scientists now believe that certain flowers may even tune themselves to the sound of pollinators, opening or releasing scent when they sense the frequency of a bee's wings nearby. In 2019, a study from Tel Aviv University found that evening primroses exposed to the sound of buzzing bees produced sweeter nectar within minutes, an adaptation that might increase pollination. It was as if the flowers could hear their visitors coming and decided to welcome them with a richer gift. If we think of this not as human-style hearing, but as sensitivity, it becomes easier to grasp. Sound is vibration, and life is full of vibration heartbeat. Breath, the pulse of sap through a stem. Plants may not have ears, but they are surrounded by a constant conversation of waves moving through matter. The slow creak of a growing tree trunk, the stretch of roots pushing through stone, the shifting of leaves as they follow the sun. All these are quiet acts of motion that generate their own subtle music. Some researchers have even recorded these internal sounds using specialized microphones, discovering faint pops and crackles as water travels through xylem tubes, a rhythm that changes with stress or drought. To listen to a tree this way is to realize that silence in nature is an illusion. There is always sound, only slower and softer than our perception allows. There is something deeply moving in the thought that plants are listeners. They stand still, not out of ignorance, but out of attention, taking in the vibrations of their world. Every breeze that moves through a forest is a message, every tremor a sign, every tone a clue about what comes next. Perhaps this is why so many cultures have imagined spirits or consciousness in trees, seeing in their stillness a kind of listening. Even without brains or ears, they may be attuned to the heartbeat of the planet itself, the hum of insects, the crackle of lightning, the songs of birds that rest in their branches. If we could hear what they hear, if we could slow down enough to match their tempo, we might realize that the world is full of quiet music. Every garden would be a concert, every forest a cathedral. The sound of growing is not made for us, yet we live within it, breathing its rhythm, walking through its invisible notes. And somewhere in that endless vibration, in that constant exchange between air, earth, and leaf, the plants are listening still. Long before forests covered the land or flowers brightened the air, long before any creature took its first breath, the world was a place of silence and haze. The oceans were dark and heavy, filled with minerals and gases rising from volcanic vents, and the air above them carried no scent of life, only the faint sting of methane and ammonia drifting through a reddish sky. Yet somewhere within that vast ancient water, in a time more than 3 billion years ago, something small began to change the course of everything. It was not a creature that walked or swam, nor one that could be seen without a microscope, but rather a single cell that learned to use light. This cell belonged to a group we now call cyanobacteria, tiny blue-green organisms that floated near the ocean's surface and discovered how to trap sunlight and turn it into energy. In that moment, the first true green light of life appeared on Earth, and the planet's long transformation began. At that time, there was no oxygen to breathe. The oceans were iron-rich, their surfaces tinted a murky red by dissolved metals, and the atmosphere lacked the clarity of the sky we know. When cyanobacteria began to capture sunlight through photosynthesis, they used it to split water molecules, taking hydrogen to build sugars and releasing oxygen as a byproduct. That reaction seemed simple: water, light, and air working together, but in those early ages it was an act of creation as profound as fire. The oxygen that escaped into the water began to react with the dissolved iron, forming rust-like minerals that sank to the sea floor, leaving behind banded layers of ironstone that can still be found in rocks today from Australia to Canada. These rocks, known as banded iron formations, serve as a geological memory of the first breath of life on Earth. For millions of years, this invisible labor continued, with cyanobacteria spreading across shallow seas, forming slimy mats called stromatolites. These structures, built layer upon layer by colonies of microbes, can still be seen today along the coast of Shark Bay in Western Australia, standing as living fossils of a time when the planet's air was still unformed. Slowly, over the course of perhaps hundreds of millions of years, the oxygen they released began to accumulate. It filled the oceans, first oxidizing iron and sulfur, and then escaped into the sky, where it transformed the atmosphere. This event, known to scientists as the Great Oxygenation Event, occurred around 2.4 billion years ago and marked the first true crisis in Earth's history. For while oxygen gave rise to new kinds of life, it also brought death to countless others that had evolved in its absence. Before oxygen, life on Earth was purely anaerobic. It thrived without air, feeding on chemical reactions drawn from minerals and heat. To those organisms, oxygen was poison, a reactive gas that corroded and destroyed their delicate balance. Changed the air. Many of these early species vanished, their way of life erased by a process they could not escape. But from that destruction came opportunity. Oxygen allowed for more complex chemistry, leading eventually to the evolution of cells with mitochondria structures that could burn oxygen efficiently for energy. From that spark, all higher life would one day emerge. Plants, animals, and finally us. The great oxygenation event also reshaped the planet itself. With more oxygen in the atmosphere, a new layer formed high above the Earth. The ozone layer, which absorbed harmful ultraviolet radiation and allowed living things to exist closer to the surface without being destroyed by sunlight. The sky, once tinted orange and filled with haze, gradually turned blue as methane decreased and light scattered through clearer air. The oceans cooled and cleared, and the stage was set for multicellular organisms to appear. It is strange, too, to think that everything from the sound of a wave to the beating of a heart depends on the quiet work of those ancient microbes that never saw a sunrise. Only the filtered glow of light through the water's surface. Scientists have traced their existence through chemical fossils known as biomarkers, found in rocks more than 3.5 billion years old. These traces tell us that life was already adapting to light when the continents were still forming, when the moon shone larger and closer, and when days were shorter, lasting only about 18 hours. The Earth of that time was young and restless, its crust shifting, its seas boiling, its air thick with gas. Yet amid that chaos, cyanobacteria performed a task so steady and so patient that it would change the color of the sky itself. In their slow turning of light into sugar and sugar into energy, they set in motion a process that has never stopped. Every green leaf, every blade of grass, and every tree draws from that same ancient invention, splitting of water and the capture of light. To imagine this early world is to see a planet without green, it's only gray stone and red dust, and then to watch a slow bloom of color spread across its face. Over millions of years, the sunlight that once only warmed the sea became something that life could use directly, a source of power drawn not from heat or mineral, but from the star itself. The cyanobacteria did not know they were transforming the planet. They simply lived, multiplied, and drifted, their microscopic lives gathering into something vast. Their waste became our breath, their byproduct our world. Even now, many of their descendants still exist in oceans and lakes, producing half the oxygen we breathe. Every inhale we take is a continuation of that ancient exchange that began before. There were forests or clouds or sound. The air that fills our lungs carries the memory of those first green sparks under the sea. When sunlight falls on a leaf and turns into energy, it is repeating the same act that began billions of years ago. The same quiet ritual of transformation that turned a barren world into one alive with color and movement. Life did not begin with noise or struggle, but with a shimmer in the water, a microscopic flicker of green light that found a way to hold the sun, and in doing so, gave the planet its first breath of eternity, in the final decades of his life. When his fame had already stretched across oceans, and his name had become a symbol for evolution itself, Charles Darwin spent his days not in the Galapagos or on distant voyages, but at home, surrounded by plants. By then, the years of long travel and public debate were behind him, and yet his curiosity had not faded, had simply turned inward, toward the quiet lives unfolding in his own greenhouse. In the soft light of Down House in Kent, he began to study what most people ignored, the slow, deliberate movements of plants, their twining, bending, and responding to touch. It was here, in what he called his green laboratory, that Darwin began to realize that plants, though rooted in place, were not passive forms of life, but subtle, responsive beings guided by a kind of quiet intelligence. He had already revolutionized the way humans saw animals, showing that instinct and adaptation were not fixed but evolved through time. Yet with plants his interest was of a different tone, more patient, more intimate, almost reverent. He wrote in a letter to a colleague in 1875 that he found them more wonderful than all the beasts of the earth. And he often joked with his children that his plants were his little pets. What fascinated him most was their motion. That nearly invisible dance that takes hours or days to unfold, using hand-drawn diagrams and glass plates coated with soot to trace movement. He and his son Francis watched as plant tips curved toward light, followed invisible paths through the air, or recoiled from a touch, as though alive to sensation. One of his earliest subjects was the climbing. Plant species like the passion flower, the pea, and the honeysuckle that could wrap their tendrils around a support as if with purpose. He noticed that their shoots did not move randomly but in circles, a motion he called circumnutation, allowing them to explore their surroundings until they found something to grasp. Once contact was made, the movement changed. The tendril tightened and hardened, securing its hold. To Darwin, this seemed more than mechanical reflex. In his notebooks from 1865, he wrote that each plant feels for support, using touch and timing to find stability. He marveled at how each tendril, in its own slow rhythm, seemed to search for something, and when it found it, responded. With precision, as though making a choice. His most revealing experiments, however, involved the sensitive plant Mimosa pudica, whose leaflets fold inward at the slightest touch. Darwin would gently tap or brush the leaves with a pencil or a fine brush, recording how long it took for them to respond and how quickly they reopened. He discovered that repeated touches caused the plant to stop reacting, as if it had learned to ignore harmless contact. Then, when he left it untouched for several hours, its sensitivity returned. It was as though the plant possessed memory, capable of distinguishing between threat and repetition. This idea that a plant might remember and adapt its reactions challenged everything people believed about vegetation at the time. Plants were considered instinctive matter, passive scenery to the story of evolution. Yet Darwin began to see them as active participants in life's design. In his greenhouse, rows of glass pots stood beside thermometers and magnifying lenses, each marked with notes in his narrow handwriting. He used threads, pins, and ink dots to track the motion of root tips and leaf curves, sometimes watching a single seedling for days. Through these patient observations, he came to suspect that the tip of a root acted almost like a brain. When he applied obstacles or drops of salt to one side of a growing root, the plant would alter its direction to avoid the irritation, suggesting a kind of decision-making. It is hardly an exaggeration, he wrote in 1880, to say that the tip of the radical acts like the brain of one of the lower animals. It was a sentence that startled readers, for it extended the notion of intelligence to something that lacked eyes, nerves, or motion as we understood it. Darwin's son, Francis, who often assisted him, remembered those late years as filled with quiet excitement. Together, they co-authored The Power of Movement in Plants. Published in 1880, a thick volume detailing hundreds of experiments that revealed the hidden behaviors of vegetation. It was not a book for casual readers. Its language was dense and its patience enormous. Yet between its pages was something more than data. It was a vision of plants as living agents, capable of responding to their world with grace and sensitivity. Francis later wrote that his father would spend hours simply watching a sprouting seed, seeing in its slow arc of growth the handwriting of life itself. Outside in the garden, he often took notes under the shade of climbing ivy and flowering vines, calling the place his outdoor laboratory. Visitors recalled seeing him bent over a small table covered in glass jars and instruments, moving from one plant to another with the same attentiveness he once gave to finches and barnacles. Letters from those years reveal his growing respect for what he called plant behavior. In one, written to the botanist Asa Gray in 1877, Darwin confessed that plants seemed to him capable of something approaching a will. He did not mean will in the human sense, but rather the ability to direct their actions in ways that served survival. The phrase "the will of plants" appeared again in his private notes, always surrounded by question marks, as if he felt the boundary between instinct and awareness thinning before his eyes. He never claimed that plants could think, only that their movements obeyed laws of coordination and sensitivity that mirrored those of animals in slower time. What he was seeing was the continuity of life, the same natural intelligence expressed in countless forms. His greenhouse became, in a sense, a mirror for his own philosophy. That nature did not draw sharp lines between living things, but wove them together in a gradual unfolding of complexity. When Darwin died in 1882, much attention was given to his grand theories of evolution, but few spoke of his last quiet passion, the secret garden that had taught him humility before the smallest of living beings. The instruments he used were left in his study, still marked with ink and soot, and the plants he had tended were passed to others. Yet the questions he planted there continued to grow. Modern botanists now study plant signaling, memory, and communication with tools he could only have imagined, confirming that the world he glimpsed in his greenhouse was real. A world where every leaf senses, every root decides, and every stem moves with purpose. It is fitting that one of the greatest minds in science spent his final years listening to the slow intelligence of plants, finding in their silence not mystery to be solved, but wisdom to be respected. A quiet reminder that even the stillest life can be full of motion, meaning, and mind. There is something hypnotic about watching a Venus flytrap in motion, its green jaws waiting with patient stillness, its edges lined with delicate trigger hairs that seem to belong to another world. To most who see it for the first time, it feels almost like an illusion, a plant pretending to be an animal, a stationary life form capable of a sudden, deliberate act. Yet behind that movement lies one of the most extraordinary secrets in all of botany. The Venus flytrap can count. It does not count in the human sense, with numbers and memory, but through pulses of electrical energy that travel through its cells like a whisper of thought. Each time something brushes against its trigger hairs, it records that touch, holding it for a few seconds, waiting for another. Only after 2 touches, within about 20 seconds, does it close its trap swiftly, decisively, and with perfect timing. In that simple rhythm of cause and delay, there is intelligence, patience, something like awareness. The story of this strange plant begins in the damp savannas of North and South Carolina, where the Venus flytrap Dionea musepulahas, grown for thousands of years in nutrient-poor soil, was first described in 1763 by North Carolina's colonial governor Arthur Dobbs, who called it a sensitive plant that closes upon anything that touches it. Charles Darwin would later become obsessed with it, calling it one of the most wonderful plants in the world. In spending years observing its motion, its digestion, and its response to stimuli, he kept dozens of specimens in his greenhouse, at Downhouse, and even fed them tiny bits of meat to study their reaction. What he saw convinced him that plants were not passive organisms, but living systems of sensitivity and decision. Their slow behavior, driven by electrical communication rather than nerves. When an insect lands between the flytrap's 2 lobes, it brushes against one of the small trigger hairs that rise from the inner surface. This touch generates a faint electrical signal called an action potential, a wave of ions moving through cell membranes. The same principle that allows signals to travel along animal nerves. The first pulse alone is not enough to close the trap. The plant waits, holding that electrical memory briefly, as if testing whether the contact was accidental. If a second touch occurs within the next 20 seconds, the signals combine, and the trap snaps shut in less than 1/10 of a second. The speed is astonishing for a plant fast enough to catch a fly mid-step, yet precise enough to avoid wasting energy on false alarms like raindrops or falling debris. In that act, the Venus flytrap reveals a kind of logic, a threshold between stimulus and decision, not unlike the neurons that govern reflexes in living animals. For centuries, naturalists wondered how a plant without muscles or a nervous system could move at all. Early observers thought it might be mechanical, a swelling and shrinking of cells like small water balloons. But experiments in the 20th century began to show that electrical signals were at the heart of the movement. In 1875, Darwin himself speculated that the transmission of an influence in plants resembled nerve impulses in animals, though he lacked the instruments to prove it. Nearly 100 years later, in the 1960s, Researchers at the University of Würzburg in Germany succeeded in measuring these action potentials directly, showing that they spread at about 10 centimeters per second through the trap tissue. With each pulse, ions flowed, membranes shifted, and tiny valves opened within the plant cells, leading to a rapid change in pressure that caused the trap to close. Like a spring released, modern studies have revealed that the fly trap does more than simply react to touch it calculates. 2 touches close the trap, but additional touches deepen its response. 3 or more touches signal that a struggling prey is inside, prompting the plant to seal its lobes tightly and begin secreting digestive enzymes. 5 touches trigger full digestion mode, activating glands that dissolve the insect into nutrients. It is a remarkable example of counting behavior in a living thing without a brain, a reminder that awareness can exist in forms and speeds we barely understand. Each electrical impulse is stored in chemical form, a short-term memory lasting just long enough for the plant to decide what to do next. Scientists now describe this as a kind of analog computation, where each pulse adds up until it reaches a critical threshold that triggers an action. In essence, the Venus flytrap performs arithmetic with electricity and time. The parallels with animal reflexes are striking. In our own bodies, neurons communicate by similar voltage changes, firing only when enough signals accumulate to cross a boundary called the action potential threshold. Both systems, plant and animal, depend on timing, repetition, and accumulation, suggesting that the roots of intelligence may lie not in consciousness, but in the physics of responsiveness itself. In recent years, biophysicists like Rainer Hedrick and others have used advanced imaging and microelectrodes to map these signals in real time. In 2016, they recorded how the plant's calcium levels change after each touch, forming patterns that resemble the firing of a neural network. When the first hair is touched, calcium floods certain cells, then fades. When the second is touched, the concentration builds past a limit, triggering closure. It is an elegant system, no brain, no synapses, only chemistry and charge. But it achieves what even early philosophers like Descartes thought impossible: sensation without consciousness. Darwin sensed this mystery long before it was proven. In his writings on carnivorous plants, he described watching the traps close as if with intention, and he wrote that the distinction between plant and animal might be far thinner than people believed. To him, the Venus flytrap was not merely a curiosity but a symbol of life's continuity, a reminder that motion, perception, and even rudimentary decision-making belonged to all living matter. I saw in its green jaws the echo of evolution's broader theme that complexity grows, not from design, but from persistence and adaptation. To watch a Venus flytrap today is to glimpse that same silent thought in motion. Beneath its surface, energy flows, counting the touches, weighing the moment, and choosing whether to act. It is not a creature that thinks or plans, yet it behaves as if it knows. Every closure is a conversation between light, water, and electricity. Each one a small echo of the ancient intelligence that runs through all of life. In its patient counting, the flytrap bridges to worlds, the animal and the plant, the moving. And the still hand shows that awareness can take root even in silence, growing without eyes, without a mouth, yet never without purpose. There are places on earth where life seems impossible, where the ground is so dry that it shatters into flakes of salt and clay, where wind moves more often than water, and where rain might not fall for years at a time. Yet even in these desolate places, life endures. In the world's driest deserts, the Atacama of Chile, the Namib of southern Africa, the high plateaus of Arabia, plants have learned to stretch time itself, to wait for decades beneath the surface, until the smallest hint of moisture calls them back to light. What appears barren is not dead, only sleeping. Beneath cracked soil and stone, seeds rest like memories, counting silent centuries until the world changes just enough for them to awaken. In the Atacama Desert, stretching 600 miles along the Pacific coast of South America, the average rainfall in some regions measures less than a millimeter a year. For centuries, Travelers called it the place where rain forgets to fall. Yet hidden among the dust lie seeds of purple malvas and yellow aganucas, plants that can remain dormant for 20 or even 30 years. When a rare coastal mist known as Kamankaka rolls inland, these seeds absorb enough moisture to stir, breaking their shells and sending out fragile shoots that bloom for a few brief weeks. Whole hillsides turn violet and gold, a fleeting miracle locals call the Desierto Florido, the flowering desert. Scientists studying it in 2015 recorded that more than 200 species of plants can awaken from the soil after decades of drought. Proof that life in the Atacama measures time not by seasons but by centuries. These plants survive because they have adapted to capture water, not from rain but from air itself. Their leaves and roots are shaped to collect fog, guiding droplets down into the soil before the heat can steal them away. Some, like the tillandsia or air plants, have no roots at all. They cling to rock or sand and drink moisture through tiny scales on their leaves. Early morning fog drifting from the Pacific is their only source of water, and yet they thrive in conditions that would kill most forms of life within days. To human eyes, their gray-green bodies appear motionless, but beneath that stillness is a perfect rhythm of survival, tuned to the faintest breath of humidity, far across the ocean. In the Namib Desert, another miracle of patience unfolds. The Namib is one of the oldest deserts on Earth, dunes older than most mountains, and yet scattered through its barren plains grows a plant so strange that it seems to belong to another era. It's known as Welwitschia mirabilis. It is the only surviving member of a lineage that dates back more than 100 million years. Each plant has just 2 leaves that never stop growing, curling and fraying with time until they resemble ribbons of green leather twisted by the wind. Some individuals are estimated to be over 2,000 years old. Their roots plunge deep into the gravel to draw water from unseen aquifers, and their leaves collect fog that drifts in from the Atlantic. In a single morning, one plant can capture several liters of moisture from mist alone, enough to sustain it through another day of relentless sun. When explorers first described the Welwitschia in the mid-19th century, they thought it must be a fossil come to life. The German botanist Friedrich Welwitsch, who found it in 1859, wrote that he could do nothing but kneel down and gaze at it, half in fear and half in wonder, as though he had stumbled upon the last survivor of a forgotten world, modern. Biologists still study it for clues about longevity and drought resistance. For within its tissues lies a form of biological endurance that defies normal growth cycles. Each plant can survive on less than an inch of rainfall per year, its metabolism, slowing almost to stillness in dry months, only to revive again when fog returns. It is not merely alive, it is remembering, waiting, and continuing. Desert plants live by rules that contradict the pace of the rest of the planet. They do not chase time, they endure it. Seeds of desert lupin can remain viable for 40 years, sealed in hard coats that resist heat and decay. When rain finally falls, the sudden flood softens their shells, and within hours they germinate, racing to flower and set new seed before the soil dries again. Cacti in the Sonoran and Sahara deserts expand and contract like living lungs, storing every drop of rain within their tissues and sealing it away behind waxy skins. Even the roots of acacia trees in the Kalahari can extend 30 meters downward, searching for hidden water tables that lie far beyond human reach. Scientists who study these ecosystems often describe them as places of extreme patience. In 2019, a team from the University of Chile found microbial colonies living under quartz rocks in the central Atacama, surviving by absorbing vapor through microscopic pores. These colonies had persisted for centuries without direct rainfall, relying only on the faint condensation that forms when night cools the surface of stone. Such discoveries remind us that deserts are not empty wastelands, but archives of resilience, living museums of how life adapts when stripped of all comfort. For those who walk among these landscapes, the silence is overwhelming. There are no rustling leaves or trickling streams, only wind sweeping across sand and the occasional whisper of movement from an insect or bird. Yet beneath the silence lies a deep conversation between sky, stone, and seed. Fog becomes water, water becomes life, and life becomes memory stored in the soil until conditions align once more. Time itself feels slower here, stretched thin across centuries. As if the desert measures its age not in years but in breaths of mist, it is easy to think of the desert as hostile, but perhaps it is simply honest. It allows only what endures. Every plant that lives here has learned the art of restraint, the ability to wait without giving up, to grow when it is time, and to sleep when it must. Their patience is not passive. It is active endurance, a quiet defiance of death. When the rains finally come, or when fog drifts ashore from a far-off sea, the desert awakens in color and fragrance, a brief reminder that, even in the harshest places, life has never forgotten how to bloom. And when the last petals fade and the ground turns dry again, the seeds will return to their waiting, holding the memory of rain within their shells, dreaming through another 100 years of dust. There are trees in the world so large, so intertwined with the life around them, that they seem less like single organisms and more like nations' empires of shade and breath that have witnessed entire centuries pass beneath their canopies. In India, the banyan tree holds such a place, a living monument that blurs the line between forest and city, between root and road, between human law and natural endurance. Its branches grow outward rather than upward, stretching into the air until they bend under their own weight, then drop new roots that reach the soil and harden into trunks. Over time, one tree becomes hundreds, a self-made colony that can cover several acres. With birds nesting in its canopy, monkeys leaping through its upper corridors, and people gathering beneath its vast shade to trade, worship, and rest. In villages across India, a banyan is not merely a tree, but a landmark. A temple, a parliament, and in some rare cases, a legal person and entity with the right to exist, protected by law as if it were a citizen. The most famous of these trees, known as the Great Banyan, stands in the Indian Botanic Garden near Kolkata. It is said to be over 250 years old, though some believe it is older still. Perhaps planted around the time the city was first taking shape under British rule. When lightning struck its central trunk in the late 19th century, splitting it apart, the surrounding roots had already grown into a ring of new trunks, each as thick as a pillar. Even after the original heart of the tree was removed, the banyan continued to expand, creating a living circle more than 450 meters wide, so vast that roads now weave through its interior, and visitors walk beneath it as though entering a green cathedral. Scientists estimate that the Great Banyan has more than 3,000 prop roots, each one both limb and support, forming what might be the largest single living organism on land. It does not rise toward the sky like the redwoods of California. Instead, it spreads, weaving a slow architecture that seems to outlast anything humans build beside it. In the northeastern hills of Meghalaya, the relationship between trees and cities takes on a different shape. There, the Khasi and Jainsha people have spent centuries guiding the aerial roots of fig trees across rivers and ravines, weaving them into living bridges. The process can take decades, 40 years sometimes. Longer because the roots must grow long and strong enough to bear weight. A young bridge begins as a scaffold of bamboo and wood, which villagers replace slowly with new tendrils as they thicken. Once complete, the structure needs no maintenance. It continues to grow stronger with time, anchoring deeper into the earth. Some of these living bridges are believed to be more than 500 years old, still in use today, carrying generations across monsoon floods. They are a quiet collaboration between human patience and the intelligence of plants. Proof that architecture does not always need to be built, can be grown. When travelers first wrote of these wonders in the 19th century, they could scarcely believe them. The British botanist Joseph Dalton Hooker described the banyans of India as forests in themselves, noting that they could shade 1,000 men and 1,000 beasts. Even today, the trees play the same role. They did in his time, meeting place, marketplace, and refuge. Beneath them, marriages are arranged, disputes are settled, and elders hold council. Their shade is the common room of the village, cooler than any roof of thatch or tin. In Hindu mythology, the banyan is a symbol of immortality and wisdom associated with Lord Shiva and with the goddess Savitri, who won her husband's life back from death beneath its branches. It represents both the material and spiritual worlds, its roots sinking into the soil, its branches reaching toward heaven, its life stretching across generations. In 2017, in the state of Uttarakhand, the High Court of India made a decision that echoed this ancient reverence. It granted legal rights to the Ganges and Yamuna rivers as living entities, and not long after, similar recognition was extended to certain sacred groves and trees. The reasoning was simple, yet profound. If corporations and institutions could hold legal personhood, why not the natural beings that sustain all life? Under such rulings, a tree can technically own land, defend itself in court through human guardians, and demand protection from harm. For the banyan, which often outlives empires and governments, this recognition seems less like a gift and more like a long overdue acknowledgement. A banyan's life can span not just centuries, but civilizations. Empires have risen and fallen under its branches, the Mughals, the British, and the countless kingdoms before them, and still it stands, unmoved by conquest or calendar. When cities expand, roads and buildings bend around it for to cut it down is not only illegal, but unthinkable to many. In several towns, urban planners have rerouted entire highways rather than harm an old banyan. A quiet reminder that even in the modern age, nature can still command deference. Some trees have witnessed revolutions, independence, and industrial growth. And still their roots continue to explore, pushing deeper into the earth with the slow confidence of something that has never needed permission to exist. What makes the banyan extraordinary is not only its size but its patience. It does not rush to grow or seek to conquer space. It simply expands through persistence, one route at a time, one season after another, till it becomes something greater than itself. Its ownership of land is not declared through documents or titles, but through endurance. A house may stand for a century, a monument for 1,000 years, but a banyan can live long enough to watch both crumble and be rebuilt. In this sense, it truly owns the city not through possession, but through continuity. Its leaves turn the air into breath. Its roots hold the soil that holds the buildings. Its shade shelters those who come and go. If one could measure the memory of a place, it would live in the rings of these trees. They remember the laughter and the prayers that have echoed beneath them, the stories told at dusk, the markets that once thrived at their base, and the countless footprints that pressed their soil. Long after maps are redrawn and names forgotten, they remain, spreading outward, binding the earth to itself. To stand beneath such a tree is to feel the strange humility of time, that no matter how far cities reach, there will always be roots deeper than our walls, older than our laws, and wiser than any empire that claims to own the land. If one were to place an electrode in a leaf and another in the soil beside it, a faint current would appear so small it could not light even the dimmest bulb, yet steady, rhythmic, and undeniably alive. This invisible flow of electricity moving through stems, roots, and membranes has always existed, a quiet pulse that underlies every act of growth. Long before wires and batteries, before humans learned to send messages through copper and glass, plants were already conducting charge, moving ions through their tissues to open pores, move water, and heal wounds. What science later named bioelectricity was once thought to belong only to animals, to the nerves and muscles that give them motion. Yet over the past century, experiment after experiment has shown that plants too are electrical beings. Their currents are slower and softer, but they are constant, shaping the way leaves unfold. Roots search and flowers turn toward the sun. In the early 1800s, Luigi Galvani and Alessandro Volta were performing experiments that would lead to the first batteries, using frog legs and metals to prove that electricity could animate flesh. Around the same time, naturalists noticed that certain plants seemed to respond to shocks of static, closing their leaves or drooping their stems. The mimosa, which Darwin studied decades later, was one of the first to reveal this hidden sensitivity. When touched, its leaflets fold inward, and that motion is driven by an electrical signal spreading through its stem and impulse. Remarkably, similar to the action potentials in an animal's nerve. Later, as instruments grew more precise, researchers found that almost all plants generate such impulses, especially when wounded or exposed to changes in light or humidity. In the 1920s, Indian scientist Jagadish Chandra Bose used delicate instruments of his own invention to measure these signals, proving that plants could transmit electrical waves through their tissues and even show fatigue, reaction time, and recovery much like living creatures with nervous systems. His demonstrations, performed before astonished audiences in London and Calcutta, showed that when a leaf was cut, a burst of voltage rippled through the plant as if pain had traveled through it. Bose called this the nervous mechanism of plants, and though many dismissed it at the time, his work would later be seen as a century ahead of its time in the modern era. Scientists studying plant physiology have confirmed that cells move. Charged particles, mainly potassium, calcium, chloride ions across membranes in patterns that resemble the firing of neurons. These tiny pulses regulate how leaves open and close, how stomata breathe water vapor into the air, and how roots steer through the dark, searching for nutrients. The entire surface of a plant is alive with gradients of charge, a living circuit that reacts to touch, light, and chemical changes. Even a single blade of grass carries within it a faint electrical field, constantly adjusting as it grows. This hidden current inspired new ideas in engineering. If plants can move charge, perhaps they can generate usable electricity. In the early 2000s, researchers in the Netherlands began experimenting with plant biobatteries, systems designed to capture the electrons that leak from roots during natural metabolic processes. Plants absorb sunlight and create sugars, and in doing so, release small amounts of organic material into the soil. Bacteria around the roots feed on these compounds and in turn produce electrons as part of their respiration. By inserting carbon electrodes into the soil near the roots, scientists found they could collect this current, tiny but measurable. 1 square meter of dense vegetation could generate enough power to light a small LED lamp continuously, fueled only by photosynthesis and soil life. The idea became the foundation for what researchers called Planty, a Dutch project that sought to create self-sustaining streetlights and sensors in wetlands using living plants as the power source. Elsewhere, architects and biologists began to dream of bioluminescent farms, where the faint glow of engineered algae or luminous plants could replace electric lighting altogether. The concept drew on discoveries from the 1980s, when scientists first transferred the gene responsible for light production in fireflies into other organisms. In 2014, a small group of synthetic biologists launched a project in California to create glowing houseplants by inserting these genes into Arabidopsis, a small mustard plant often used in laboratories. The early results were faint, barely enough to see in total darkness, but the symbolism was striking. It suggested a future where power might not be something extracted from the earth, but something grown, woven into the very fabric of life. There are rice paddies in Japan and wetlands in the Netherlands where this idea is already taking shape. Small electrodes buried in the mud capture energy from the microbial processes around plant roots. Feeding sensors that measure water levels, salinity, or temperature. These devices, powered entirely by living systems, can operate for years without replacement. The current they generate is weak but unending, drawn from the same flow of energy that keeps the plants alive. It blurs the boundary between nature and technology, turning soil into circuitry, photosynthesis into fuel. What fascinates scientists most about plant electricity is not its strength, but its meaning. It shows that communication in nature is not confined to sound or sight, but happens through movement of charge, through signals too small for us to feel. When a forest experiences drought, trees send electrical impulses down their roots, altering how they absorb water and when they release it. When a leaf is bitten by an insect, voltage changes sweep through nearby tissues, prompting the release of defensive chemicals. It is as though the forest itself hums with faint electricity, every stem and branch connected in a living grid that responds to the world. In recent years, artists and engineers have begun to listen to these signals directly, turning them into Sound. Electrodes attached to leaves capture their tiny fluctuations, converting them into music that changes with sunlight, humidity, or touch. The resulting tones are ghostly and irregular, as though the plant were breathing through an instrument of air and time. It reminds us that technology and life are not opposites, but reflections of the same principle, the flow of energy seeking balance. Electricity. At its core is the movement of potential, a difference between one point and another, and that is also what life is. Whether through copper wires or living roots, it travels, connects, and transforms. The line between human engineering and nature's own design is thinner than it seems. The spark that powers our cities and the one that opens a flower at dawn are made of the same restless current, both drawn from the same ancient charge that still flows through every leaf and every heartbeat on earth. In the quiet fields and deep forests of the world, there exists a struggle so constant and so intricate that it has shaped the surface of the earth more profoundly than any war waged by humankind. It is a conflict that takes place without sound. Without movement we can easily see. And yet its strategies are complex, its tactics patient, and its victories absolute. Every plant, from the smallest blade of grass to the tallest tree, lives in competition for one resource above all others: light. To reach it, they twist, stretch, and adapt, weaving themselves into patterns of rivalry and survival that unfold over years and centuries. Though rooted in place, they are not passive. They battle with shadow and scent, with timing and chemistry, with roots and leaves, each using the tools evolution has given them to claim a fraction more sunlight than their neighbors. It begins, always, with light. The sun is both their sustenance and their battleground. In a dense jungle, only 1 or 2% of the sunlight that strikes the canopy ever reaches the forest floor. The trees that tower above hoard that light, like treasure, spreading wide crowns of leaves that intercept every photon. Beneath them, smaller plants must adapt or perish. Some learn to live on the scraps broad-leaved ferns and shade-loving orchids that thrive in the dim green half-light. Others evolve faster growth, sending shoots racing upward whenever a gap opens in the canopy. Botanists studying tropical forests in Borneo and the Amazon have found that when an old tree falls and sunlight floods the ground, seeds lying dormant for decades suddenly germinate, as if awakened by the promise of light. Within months, hundreds of saplings compete to fill the opening, and within years, the gap closes again, sealed by the leaves of new giants. The war resumes, silent but unending. In grasslands, the struggle takes another form. There, the battle for light is fought not with towering canopies, but with timing. Plants that grow side by side must decide in their own slow way when to bloom, when to seed, and when to sleep. In the American prairies, for instance, certain wildflowers have evolved to sprout earlier than their neighbors, taking advantage of the spring sun before the taller grasses emerge. Others delay until midsummer, when the tall stems of big bluestem or switchgrass begin to yellow, and space opens again for their brief season of color. This rotation of timing, what ecologists call phenological partitioning, allows many species to coexist in the same field, each finding a moment of advantage in the turning of the year. To the human eye, it seems harmonious, but beneath that calm rhythm lies a subtle race measured in days and inches. Yet sunlight alone does not decide victory. Plants have learned to use chemistry as weaponry, releasing compounds that hinder or poison competitors. This phenomenon, known as allelopathy, was first observed centuries ago, but studied seriously only in the 20th. The ancient Greeks had noticed that certain crops would not grow near walnut trees, and later, farmers in Asia spoke of rice fields where weeds mysteriously failed to thrive. In 1937, Austrian scientist Hans Molisch gave the process its name, derived from the Greek words for mutual suffering. He showed that plants like black walnut, rye, and sorghum release chemicals through their roots and fallen leaves that suppress the growth of other species nearby. These invisible toxins drift through the soil and air, creating zones of dominance where rivals cannot gain a foothold. The black walnut tree, for example, produces a compound called juglone, a colorless molecule that interferes with the respiration of nearby plants. Tomatoes, apples, and even many wildflowers wither if they grow too close to its roots. Around each tree, a silent ring of emptiness forms, as though the soil itself has taken sides. In the deserts of California, the creosote bush releases resins that inhibit seed germination around it, maintaining a perfect spacing that reduces competition for water and light. Scientists once believed the even pattern of these shrubs was coincidence. Now, they see it as design born from chemistry and necessity. Even among trees that appear peaceful, competition runs deep. In forests of Europe, beeches and oaks engage in what foresters call the shade race. Young beeches can tolerate years of darkness under a canopy, their leaves thin and wide, their metabolism slow, while oak seedlings demand more light, but grow faster when they find it. Over time, the composition of the forest shifts, one species rising and another fading, depending on which gains the edge. Japanese researchers have even recorded how some trees adjust the angle of their leaves to block or steal light from neighbors, optimizing every ray. It is a choreography of survival so slow that only the patience of time can reveal it. There are also alliances amid the conflict. In certain tropical forests, climbing vines and host trees form uneasy partnerships. A vine uses the trunk for support, reaching sunlight it could never reach alone, while the tree tolerates it only so long as the burden is light. When the vine grows too heavy, the host's branches weaken, and the balance shifts from cooperation to strangulation. The strangler fig is the most dramatic example. Its seeds germinate high on another tree, sending roots downward until they encase the host completely, eventually killing it and standing alone in its place. To an observer, the transformation is slow but merciless, one life absorbed into another. Victory achieved not by speed but by endurance. What makes this slow war remarkable is that it operates without intent or malice. The plants do not know they are competing, yet their actions mirror strategies we might call cunning. They measure space with roots, they sense light with leaves, they adjust their growth when shaded, and they use chemicals to claim territory. Some even communicate warnings. Certain species are attacked by herbivores. They release airborne signals that prompt neighbors to increase defensive compounds, ensuring the enemy meets resistance wherever it turns. It is easy to think of the plant world as peaceful, but beneath its calm exterior lies a ceaseless tension, the constant negotiation of who gets to live in the sun. The weapons of this war are invisible, the battles drawn out across generations, but the results are written in every landscape we see. Forests where only certain trees prevail, meadows that bloom in sequence like waves, deserts patterned in perfect spacing, and city gardens where some flowers quietly suffocate others. The earth's green cover is not a harmony of equals, but a tapestry woven from countless small struggles for light. Every leaf that opens is a declaration of victory. Every shadow, a quiet defeat, and every dawn, the beginning of another day in a war that has no sound. No blood and no end-only growth, decay, and the endless reaching for the sun. There is a moment in almost every garden just before dusk, when the air itself seems to turn to silk, filled with a sweetness so delicate that it feels alive. The scent of flowers moves through that hour like a memory, too old to name, gentle and invisible, yet powerful enough to stop a passerby in mid-step. To most of us, fragrance is beauty and indulgence, symbol of peace or love, but to the plants that create it, scent is neither decoration nor luxury. It is strategy. Beneath every perfume lies chemistry, and beneath that chemistry lies intent. The coded language of attraction and defense that has shaped the evolution of both plants and animals for more than 100 million years of flowers. Fragrance is a map of its survival, and what seems to us like generosity is, in truth, manipulation refined over time into art. When the first flowers appeared on Earth, around 140 million years ago, the planet already belonged to the wind. Before petals, plants relied on air and water to carry their pollen from one blossom to another, scattering chants across open landscapes. But as insects began to multiply and diversify, the plants adapted. They began to use color, shape, and scent to guide these new partners, to summon them, reward them, and control them. Every aroma we breathe today is a remnant of that ancient alliance, an evolutionary contract written in molecules. The sweetness of jasmine, the spice of clove, the sharp note of citrus or pine-all are signals sent not to us, but to pollinators. Bees, moths, beetles, and bats. Scientists have identified more than 1,700 volatile compounds used by flowering plants to communicate. These molecules drift through air, dissolve in humidity, and reach the receptors of insects or animals that decode their meaning. Some scents promise food nectar rich with sugar or pollen full of protein. Others promise shelter, warmth, or simply the illusion of safety. For a bee, the faint scent of lavender or almond is not pleasure but instruction, a marker pointing the way to sustenance. For a moth flying through darkness, the perfume of a night-blooming flower like Nicotiana acts as a beacon, drawing it from miles away. The same chemicals that delight the human senses operate as the coordinates of survival for countless other species. Yet attraction is only half of the story. Chemistry of flowers is also the chemistry of defense. Many of the same oils that smell pleasant to us are toxic to herbivores, fungi, or bacteria. The mint family, for example, produces menthol and thymol compounds that repel insects and inhibit microbial growth, giving the plants both fragrance and protection. Similarly, roses and geraniums manufacture geraniol, which deters ants and aphids while scenting the air with sweetness. Even the narcissus, with its delicate white petals, contains alkaloids that can poison grazing animals. The line between perfume and poison is fine, and often the two coexist within the same bloom. What is intoxicating to one creature may be deadly to another, in some species. This duality becomes a form of deception so refined that it borders on psychological warfare. Orchids, among the most complex of all flowers, are masters of manipulation. There are more than 20,000 species, each with its own strategy for reproduction. Some mimic the scent of female insects so precisely that males attempt to mate with the flower itself, coating their bodies with pollen in the process. The bee orchid, Aphera, found across Europe, releases chemicals identical to those produced by a female bee. To the male, the mimicry is irresistible. He lands, vibrates his wings in courtship, and leaves carrying the orchid's pollen sacs attached to his body like medals of misplaced affection. The plant offers no nectar, no reward. Only illusion, and yet the deception works perfectly. Repeated across generations. At the other extreme of the floral spectrum lies the corpse lily, Rafflesia arnoldi, a plant so rare and strange that it seems to defy the very idea of beauty. It's found in the rainforests of Sumatra and Borneo. It produces the largest individual flower in the world, sometimes over a meter wide, emits an odor of rotting flesh. The smell attracts carrion flies, which mistake the blossom for a dead animal and crawl inside to feed or lay eggs. In doing so, they collect and spread the plant's pollen, unknowingly serving its reproductive cycle. What to the fly is promise and decay, to the flower is opportunity. Its beauty lies not in appearance, but in its understanding of hunger. This manipulation extends beyond insects. Some tropical trees release compounds that mimic the pheromones of elephants, drawing the animals to their fruit and ensuring the seeds are dispersed across great distances. Others emit alarm scents when damaged, warning nearby plants of approaching herbivores. When a caterpillar begins to chew a leaf, the plant releases volatile chemicals that attract parasitic wasp predators of the caterpillar. The result is a network of communication so intricate that it resembles a living intelligence. A system of defense conducted through chemistry rather than sound to humans. These same molecules become symbols of emotion, industry, and art. The ancient Egyptians extracted oils from lotus and myrrh for their temples. The Persians distilled roses into perfume as early as the 10th century. And modern chemists have built entire economies on the replication of scents once known only to nature. But in doing so, We have borrowed the weapons of plants, carrying their survival tools into our own rituals of love and memory.
The fragrance.
That lingers on a wrist or a letter, the perfume that fills a room, still speaks in the same ancient language, one of attraction, persistence, and warning. The paradox of the flower lies in its ability to make struggle appear as beauty. Every color, every petal, every breath of scent is part of an evolutionary game where seduction and defense are inseparable. A flower opens not to be admired, but to compete, to lure allies and repel enemies, to ensure that its lineage continues after the wind has carried its perfume away. We stand among them and breathe their chemistry, unaware that what moves us with wonder is also what keeps them alive. And when the evening air fills again with that invisible sweetness, it is not only fragrance we are inhaling, it is the story of survival written in scent, the language of attraction and danger that has outlasted empires and will continue long after the last gardener has gone home and the night has taken the garden back into silence. There are places on earth where the air itself feels alive, thick with the breath of leaves, where sound never fully stops, and every inch of space seems to be listening. In the heart of the great tropical rainforests, the Amazon, the Congo, the jungles of Borneo and New Guinea, life does not grow in neat layers or clear divisions. It overlaps, converses, and remembers. A single square mile of Amazonian forest can contain more species of plants than the entire continent of Europe. And yet what makes it extraordinary is not only the abundance, but the communication that holds it all together. To walk through a rainforest is to step inside a living mind, a vast network of information, adaptation, memory that has been refining itself for tens of millions of years. Here vines find their way toward trunks without sight, roots trade nutrients across invisible networks. Trees time their flowering not by the clock of the sun, but by the rhythms of rain, soil, and insect migration. The jungle is not chaos, it is coordination at a scale too large and too slow for us to easily perceive. The explorers who first entered these forests in the 16th and 17th centuries, men like Francisco de Orellana and Alexander von Humboldt, turned with tales that seemed impossible. They wrote of trees that walked, of flowers that trapped animals, of leaves that bled red sap when cut. To European readers, these reports sounded like fantasy. Yet the truth was stranger still. Everything in the jungle seemed designed not merely to survive, but to communicate its presence to others. Humboldt, writing from the Orinoco in 1800, described the forest as a chamber of whispering life, where trees responded to storms by releasing scents that drifted for miles, summoning insects that arrived as though invited. He noticed how lightning strikes triggered mass flowering events, how vines adjusted their thickness based on the resistance of the trunks they climbed, and how rivers carried not only seeds but stories of the forest's inner workings. Tiny organisms that shaped the soil, algae that tinted the water, spores that traveled like letters across continents in the centuries that followed. The work of cataloging the rainforest became a lifetime pursuit for many naturalists. The 20th century alone saw thousands of new species discovered, often by accident. In 1925, the explorer Percy Fawcett disappeared into the Amazon while searching for what he called the lost city of Z. But what he truly sought was understanding, proof that beneath the canopy lay an organized intelligence of life. Later, botanists such as Richard Evans Schultz of Harvard would spend decades among the plants of the Amazon, studying not just their biology, but their relationships to the people who lived there. Schultz, working in the 1940s, documented how indigenous communities like the Kofan, the Shuar, and the Tucano viewed the forest not as a collection of separate species, but as a single living entity with thought and memory. He wrote that every plant had a purpose, every vine a lineage, and that the knowledge of these connections was passed not through books, but through ceremony, song, and use. Among the people of the Upper Amazon, the concept of plants as teachers is ancient. Certain plants are believed to hold wisdom that can be revealed through dreams or through careful preparation and ritual. The Banisteriopsis vine, for example, used in the sacred brew known as ayahuasca, is regarded not as a drug but as a spirit with consciousness, one that teaches respect, discipline, and understanding of the interconnected world. Elders speak of listening to the forest as one listens. To an elder, of learning which roots heal fever, which bark repels snakes, which leaves can stop bleeding or call the rain. The forest is not conquered, it is conversed with. Knowledge here does not separate science from spirit, because both describe the same truth. That every act of growth is also an act of communication. Modern science has begun to uncover the physical reality behind this worldview. Underground, the roots of trees and plants are joined by networks of mycorrhizal fungi, forming what ecologists now call the wood wide web. Through this network, carbon, water, and even electrical signals move between organisms. When one tree is attacked by pests, others nearby increase their defenses before the threat arrives. When a young sapling struggles in shade, an older tree can share nutrients through these underground pathways. In a rainforest where diversity is greatest, this connectivity becomes extraordinary, hundreds of species participating in a single, collective metabolism that crosses root and stem, flower and insect. It is a system that behaves almost like a nervous system capable of feedback, adaptation, and memory. Scientists studying the Amazon's atmosphere have found that the forest even generates its own weather. Water drawn up by roots and released through millions of leaves becomes vapor that forms clouds, which then return as rain. The process is so vast that satellites can measure it. The forest literally creates its own climate, recycling the same water through the sky again and again. When drought strikes, the trees adjust, closing their pores to conserve moisture, altering the balance of carbon in the air. The entire biome breathes as one. In this sense, the idea of a thinking jungle is not poetic exaggeration. It is a description of an ecological intelligence. It's one that maintains equilibrium through constant sensing and response. But where scientists see systems, indigenous cultures have long seen personality and kinship. To the Yanomami, the forest is inhabited by spirits called Zapuripu, invisible beings that live in the roots and canopy, guiding the balance of life. To cut down a tree carelessly or poison a river is to offend these spirits, to break the continuity of memory that binds the living world. In recent decades, as deforestation has accelerated, many indigenous leaders have spoken of the forest's sadness, the silence that follows when trees are felled, the loss not only of shade and oxygen, but of conversation itself. In their view, the jungle forgets when it is destroyed. And when it forgets, the world becomes less alive. To walk in a rainforest is to feel both awe and humility. To sense that the ground beneath one's feet is older and wiser than any civilization. That treads upon it, every leaf seems to listen, every root seems to remember. The jungle does not think in words or numbers, yet it processes information through growth, through change, through the endless balancing of life and decay. It learns, forgets, and learns again, generation after generation, seed after seed. All our science, we are only beginning to understand what the people who have lived among these forests have always known. That intelligence does not belong solely to creatures that move and speak, but also to those that stand still and breathe. For the world, the jungle is not merely a habitat. It is a mind with no center, a network that outlives empires, a green memory that thinks in the language of rain. If you hold a leaf to the light and look closely enough, you can almost see the secret it carries within. Trembling skin of green that has been working without pause for more than 3 billion years. A silent machine so precise and enduring that all life on Earth depends upon its rhythm. Within that leaf, within every green cell of every blade of grass, fern, or tree, exists a factory smaller than a grain of dust, yet more efficient than any engine we have ever built. These tiny structures, called chloroplasts, perform the ancient miracle of photosynthesis, the conversion of sunlight, water, and air into sugar. The substance that feeds every living thing either directly or through the long chain of consumption. Long before humans learned to make fire or harness electricity, these microscopic engines were already mastering the art of turning light into life, running on nothing but the energy of the sun. when the first chloroplasts appeared, the Earth was still young and harsh. They were once free-living cyanobacteria that found a way to capture sunlight using a pigment called chlorophyll. At some point, about 1.5 billion years ago, one of these bacteria was engulfed by another cell, but not digested, and from that union came the first plant-like cell. It was an accident that became permanence, a partnership that would eventually cover the planet in green. Each chloroplast inside a modern leaf still carries remnants of that ancient independence, its own DNA, its own small machinery for making proteins, its own rhythm of division and repair. Inside, sunlight strikes the molecules of chlorophyll, exciting electrons that move through membranes like tiny sparks of thought. Water, drawn from the roots, is split apart, releasing oxygen into the air and hydrogen into the process that makes sugar. Carbon dioxide, absorbed through the leaf's pores, is fixed into glucose, the first form of chemical food. Every breath we take and every calorie we consume begins here, in this microscopic exchange between light and matter. Scientists have compared the efficiency of photosynthesis to human technology, and even at its simplest level, the comparison humbles us. A single square meter of healthy leaf tissue can capture about 200 watts of sunlight energy and convert nearly 5% of it into stored chemical energy, a percentage that may sound small, yet it is achieved quietly, continuously, without heat, pollution, or waste. By contrast, the most advanced solar panels designed by humans rarely exceed 20% efficiency and require metals, mining, and maintenance. The leaf, meanwhile, renews itself, repairing damaged cells, and shedding old ones in an endless cycle of renewal. It is not simply a machine, it is a self-sustaining energy network that turns chaos into order, light into structure, and air into sustenance. When you look at a forest from above, what you are really seeing is billions upon billions of these chloroplasts at work, all drawing sunlight into themselves. It's all contributing to what scientists now call the planet's green pulse. Satellites orbiting hundreds of kilometers above the Earth can measure this pulse by tracking how much light the surface absorbs and reflects. In the early 1980s, NASA began collecting data through a program known as the Advanced Very High Resolution Radiometer, which observed seasonal changes in vegetation across the globe. Later missions, such as MODIS aboard the Terra satellite, refined this data into detailed maps showing how the Earth breathes. In spring, the northern hemisphere glows deep green as chloroplasts awaken across fields and forests. Tone fades to brown and gray as they die back or fall into dormancy. From space, the planet appears to inhale and exhale once each year, its atmosphere rising and falling in carbon content as plants absorb and release the gas. This cycle, measured in invisible waves of color, is not just a sign of growth, is proof of balance, the slow coordination between sunlight, life, and air that keeps the planet habitable. In certain years, when droughts or wildfires scar the land, the satellites detect small falters in the green pulse, moments when the planet's breath stutters. Scientists studying these fluctuations can tell when crops fail, when rainforests lose density, or when deserts begin to spread. Yet even through these disturbances, the global pattern continues, anchored by the resilience of photosynthesis. It has endured mass extinctions, ice ages, and volcanic winters, surviving events that blotted out the sun for years at a time. Chloroplasts wait in seeds, in spores, in the cells of algae drifting under the sea, ready to begin again as soon as light returns. No machine ever built by human hands could restart itself so faithfully after millions of years of dormancy. Yet the machinery of the leaf does so without command or repair. Inside the chloroplast, the process unfolds in two stages, known as the light reactions and the Calvin cycle, names that make it sound almost mechanical. But what actually occurs is closer to alchemy. In the first stage, photons strike a collection of pigments called photosystem II, knocking electrons loose and creating an energy current. The water molecules are split, producing oxygen as a byproduct. The liberated electrons pass through a chain of proteins, creating molecules of energy currency known as ATP and NADPH. In the second stage, carbon dioxide molecules are captured and stitched together into glucose. A process first described in the 1950s by Melvin Calvin at the University of California, Berkeley, for which he received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1961. The reaction happens millions of times every second across the surface of the planet, so constant that the total energy produced by photosynthesis each year dwarfs all the electricity generated by humanity since the dawn of civilization. If one listens to it in metaphor, the leaf is not unlike an engine that hums with light instead of fuel, a device so perfectly tuned that it wastes nothing. It does not seek to dominate or consume beyond its need. It balances, recycles, and shares. The sugar it makes feeds not only the plant, but the entire web of life: herbivores that eat the leaves, carnivores that eat the herbivores, and decomposers that return the carbon to the air and soil, completing the circle. Even our own inventions, solar panels, batteries, power grids, are echoes of this older wisdom, attempts to replicate what the chloroplast has been doing since the dawn of life. And so, the sunlight falls on a leaf, it is not merely warmth or brightness, it is history striking matter, an ancient reaction continuing without pause. The leaf does not burn or fade. It translates. It gathers light from a star 150 million kilometers away and stores it within itself, quiet and invisible, until it becomes movement, breath, or thought. Every city, every forest, every living thing that walks or swims or flies carries that energy. Within, it is the one perfect machine, older than fire, still running, still silent, still turning sunlight into the sweetness that sustains the world far to the north. Beyond the last forests, where the wind moves unhindered and the ground never fully softens, there are forms of life so small and patient that they appear to belong more to stone than to anything living. In these frozen realms where the soil is locked in ice and the air carries little warmth, the familiar rhythm of growth all but stops, yet it does not vanish entirely. The world's coldest landscapes are not lifeless deserts, but slow kingdoms of endurance, places ruled by lichens, mosses, and tiny algae that have mastered the art of survival in the absence of comfort. They do not rise like trees or bloom like flowers. Instead, they wait hidden beneath frost, waking only when the brief kiss of sunlight or thaw makes life possible again. Every inch of tundra and glacier carries their quiet persistence, a reminder that life, once born, never truly surrenders, no matter how thin the light or how deep the cold. Lichens are among the first inhabitants of these regions. Strange partnerships of fungus and algae bound together in perfect balance. They cling to rock faces and ice-crusted soil across the Arctic and Antarctic, surviving temperatures that would kill most other organisms within hours. What looks like a smear of gray or green upon a boulder is in fact a tiny civilization conducting photosynthesis whenever the sun breaks through the clouds, storing that faint energy in chemical form to sustain it through months of darkness. In the Arctic tundra, species such as Cladonia rangiferina, known as reindeer moss, spread in pale mats across the landscape, feeding herds of caribou and muskox through long winters. Each tuft grows only a few millimeters a year, yet they can live for centuries, weathering storms that flatten mountains and strip valleys bare. Their strategy is not resistance, but surrender. They dry out completely when frozen, halting all metabolic activity, and revive instantly when moistened. As though life were a switch that can be turned off and on at will in the high alpine zones of the world. From the Himalayas to the Andes, mosses and liverworts employ a similar patience. At altitudes where trees can no longer root and the air grows thin enough to sting, these small plants form soft carpets that trap moisture and insulate the soil beneath. Scientists studying them have found that they can photosynthesize at temperatures just above freezing, and in some cases even below it, using a form of chlorophyll adapted to capture the weakest rays of light. The Austrian botanist Lorenz Kranner once described them as machines of waiting, able to remain dormant for a decade and awaken within hours of thawing snow. In 2014, researchers excavating a glacier on Ellesmere Island in Canada found moss samples that had been entombed in ice for over 400 years. When placed in light and water, the moss began to grow again, its green returning as though centuries of darkness had been no more than a long night. Even Antarctica, the coldest continent on Earth, holds such survivors along the rocky coastlines. And in the sheltered valleys near the transantarctic mountains, microscopic algae live within layers of ice and stone, performing photosynthesis at temperatures below zero. These organisms inhabit what scientists call cryoconite, whole small depressions in glacier surfaces filled with meltwater, dust, and microbial life. Within them, sunlight refracts through ice crystals, creating enough warmth for the algae to carry out their slow work. In 2015, a team of biologists drilling through the Ross Ice Shelf found traces of photosynthetic pigments 30 meters below the surface, evidence that light, even when filtered and weakened, can still sustain life where none should exist. It is a discovery that redefines the edge of habitability, suggesting that anywhere light can reach, no matter how faintly, life will find a way to hold on. The endurance of these cold-dwelling organisms has drawn explorers and scientists alike for generations. Early polar expeditions, such as those led by Fridtjof Nansen in 1893 and Robert Falcon Scott in 1911, carried not only ambitions of discovery, but also quiet fascination with the resilience of life under such extremes. On those journeys, pressed between paper or preserved in jars, are still kept in museums today, their colors as vivid as the day they were taken from the ice. Later studies would reveal that these simple forms of life play a crucial role in shaping the polar environment itself. Lichens slowly break down rock into soil through the acids they secrete, creating the first foothold for mosses and other plants when the climate allows. In turn, these pioneer species trap moisture and carbon, forming miniature ecosystems that support insects, bacteria, and even small vertebrates. In this way, life builds itself upward from almost nothing, layering patience upon patience until the land is alive again. What fascinates researchers most about these organisms is their mastery of dormancy. Unlike animals, which must maintain constant warmth and motion to live, these plants in symbiotic forms embrace stillness. They accept freezing, dehydration, and darkness not as death, but as a pause, a suspension of being. When warmth returns, their cells thaw, their pigments reawaken, and metabolism resumes as if no time has passed. Some scientists studying these adaptations believe they hold clues for preserving crops or even human tissues in extreme conditions, while others see them as models for possible life on other worlds. Mars, with its cold deserts and rare sunlight, resembles these environments more than any tropical forest, and if life exists there, it may look less like an animal and more like a lichen, holding memory through centuries of waiting to stand. In such a landscape is to feel time differently. The air moves, but nothing else seems to. The snow glows faintly under the low sun. The rocks gleam with thin crusts of green and orange lichen, and every sound is swallowed by the distance. It is a world reduced to essentials: light, cold, and endurance. In these frozen places, life does not conquer but coexists. It bends and pauses, measuring progress, not by growth but by survival. Every patch of moss, every film of algae beneath ice, is a testament to the quiet perfection of adaptation, proof that even in the most inhospitable corners of the planet, the conversation between sunlight and living matter continues. And when the long night finally breaks and a weak dawn spills across the snow, those hidden machines awaken once more, turning the faintest glow into life itself, keeping the Earth's story alive in the stillness of the cold in the rainforests of South America, where light filters through the canopy like slow-moving water and every root seems to twist with intention. There grows a tree that has long confounded both locals and scientists: the walking palm, known to botanists as Socratia exorhiza. It rises on a tangle of stilt-like roots that appear to lift it slightly above the forest floor, like the legs of an insect frozen mid-step. To those who live among these forests, the legend is older than science. They say the tree can walk, that it moves quietly across the jungle in search of light, inching its way toward open ground as the forest shifts around it. The movement is Said to be so slow that no one has ever seen it happen, and yet after years the tree stands in a new place, leaving behind a cluster of old, dead roots where it once grew. The truth, as often happens, lies somewhere between myth and mechanism. The walking palm does not walk in any way we would recognize, but its roots do something extraordinary. Instead of a single base buried deep in the soil, the tree grows dozens of long, woody supports that extend outward from its trunk like spokes of a wheel, gripping the ground for balance on the uneven terrain of the rainforest. As time passes, and the light above changes, perhaps a larger tree falls, or vines overtake the canopy, the palm begins to grow new roots toward the brighter direction. The older roots on the shaded side slowly die and decay. In the trunk, over months and years, shifts slightly, its base creeping toward the light. Some studies suggest it can move up to 10 or 20 centimeters a year, no more than a child's handspan, yet over a decade becomes a full step. Quiet migration across the forest floor. The idea that a tree might move unsettles the human sense of time. We are used to thinking of plants as fixed, of nature as a still picture painted across the landscape, but in truth, everything alive is in motion. Only the pace differs. For the walking palm, movement is an act of survival written in centuries, rather than seconds. Its slow crawl allows it to find the scattered pools of sunlight that sustain its growth in the dense, competitive ecosystem of the Amazon. Light here is currency, and every plant that survives must find a way to reach it. Some stretch upward in a single leap, others climb upon their neighbors. And a few, like Socratia, Exorhiza, choose the long road, moving their entire foundations, inch by inch through the living maze. Botanists who have studied the species since the 1980s have debated whether it truly walks or whether this appearance of movement is illusion. John H. Bodley, one of the early researchers to document the tree's root structure, described in 1980 how its stilt roots anchor the tree in soft, shifting soil, protecting it from floods and erosion. Later, Gerardo Valos, of the University of Costa Rica, tested the movement theory by observing marked trees for several years and found only subtle changes in root patterns, not enough to prove locomotion in the animal sense. Yet even he admitted that the roots behave in a directional way, growing toward light and open ground. The question, perhaps, is not whether the tree walks, but how we define walking. In a world where time stretches beyond our lifetimes, a movement of a few centimeters might still be a journey. For the people who live near these forests, the tree's slow motion is less a scientific puzzle than a lesson. Guides in Peru and Ecuador tell travelers that the palm follows the sun, moving to where it can see the sky again after larger trees block its path. They point to the skeletons of old roots on one side and the green ones on the other, proof that it is traveling, albeit on a scale to long for a human witness. In a way, the legend honors the tree's persistence. It teaches that motion is not always fast, that seeking light can be a matter of patience rather than speed. There's a quiet beauty in this idea, that a living thing can migrate without leaving its home. The walking palm's roots, shaped like stilts, make it look as though it is preparing to rise and take a step at any moment. Yet it never truly lifts itself, it simply rebuilds, renewing its foundation while letting the old supports fade. Reminds us that progress can mean letting go of what once held us steady, that adaptation is often invisible until time has passed. The forest, with its constant cycle of growth and decay, does not rush. It waits. And the tree, too, waits. Making its decisions in silence, scientists studying tropical ecosystems often describe trees as architects of stability. But the walking palm is something else. It is an architect of motion. It's designing its own mobility in a world that seems immovable. Its behavior blurs the boundary between animal and plant, between the restless and the rooted. When we see it standing on its spindly roots, we cannot help but sense a kind of intention in its form, as though it were poised mid-thought, measuring distance, preparing for a move that might take years. In this way, the walking palm challenges not just our understanding of plants, but our understanding of time itself. What we call stillness may simply be movement too slow to notice, and what we call permanence may be the illusion of speed too fast to measure. The forest moves as one-body trees growing toward light. Vines tightening, leaves unfolding. Fungi spreading beneath the soyland, the palm is a visible reminder of that grand, patient choreography. Its slow pilgrimage through shadow and sun becomes a meditation on change, a quiet defiance of what we think life should look like. Somewhere in the depths of the Amazon, under a canopy so dense that the sunlight filters down like dust, the walking palm continues its ancient journey, stepping through centuries without leaving a trace of haste. Its roots mark the path of its persistence. Its leaves whisper in the language of patience. And in its stillness, we can glimpse a truth that humbles our own sense of urgency. That movement, in the oldest and most enduring sense, is not measured in distance or speed, but in the ability to keep reaching toward light, no matter how long it takes to arrive. For most of human history, the idea that a plant could think would have seemed absurd. Thought people believed required a brain, a nervous system, eyes and ears, a sense of awareness moving behind it all. Plants had none of these, and so they were thought to be simple alive. Yes, but mechanical, reacting without knowing, moving without feeling, growing without choosing. Yet as the 20th century ended and the 21st began, a quiet revolution took shape in the study of botany, one that began to blur the line between reflex and response, between mere growth and behavior. In laboratories and greenhouses from Florence to Sydney, scientists began to uncover evidence that plants could learn, remember, and adapt in ways that suggested something very much like intelligence, even if it took a form entirely unlike our own. The plant mind, they began to call it not a brain hidden in the roots or leaves, but a distributed awareness that flowed through the whole organism, a pattern of sensitivity so subtle and so ancient that we had overlooked it for centuries. Early hints of this came from the work of pioneers like Charles Darwin and his son Francis, who in 1880 proposed that the tip of a root might act like a brain of the lower animals, sensing and directing the rest of the plant's growth. For decades, this idea lay dormant, overshadowed by the rise of neurobiology and animal psychology. But it re-emerged in the 1970s and 1980s as researchers developed instruments sensitive enough to detect electrical and chemical signaling in plants. They found that when a leaf was touched or wounded, a wave of voltage moved through the tissues, much like the firing of neurons. When exposed to repeated stimuli, plants altered their reactions, responding differently over time as if they had learned what to expect. One of the most striking modern experiments came in 2014, when Dr. Monica Gagliano at the University of Western Australia trained pea plants to associate light with a neutral signal fan blowing air. In the setup, young pea seedlings grew in way-shaped mazes, where a fan and a light source could be placed at either end. When the fan always preceded the light from one direction, the plants began to grow toward the fan alone, anticipating that the light would follow. This kind of associative learning was once thought to belong exclusively to animals with nervous systems, yet here were plants demonstrating a version of it. When the conditions were reversed, the plants adjusted, changing their direction of growth according to the new pattern, suggesting not only learning but flexible memory. Skeptics argued that such results could be explained by hidden variables, moisture, gradients, temperature, or vibration, but further experiments strengthened the case for plant memory. Gagliano herself conducted studies on the sensitive plant Mimosa pudica, famous for folding its leaves when touched. She repeatedly dropped the plants from a small height, enough to trigger the folding response, but not to harm them. After several drops, the plants stopped reacting, as if realizing the stimulus was harmless. Weeks later, when the same plants were dropped again, they still ignored it, showing that they had retained the information over time. When new plants that had never been dropped were tested, they responded with immediate folding, proving that the earlier individuals had indeed remembered and adjusted. What this implied was not thought as we understand it, but a kind of memory stored not in neurons, but in chemical states within the cells. Plants seem to encode experiences through changes in hormone levels, ion concentrations, and gene activity, using these subtle shifts to alter their future behavior. They can remember droughts, adjusting their water use for years afterward. They can sense the approach of pests through airborne signals and prepare defenses before being attacked. In one study published in 2016, researchers observed that certain plants emitted different volatile compounds depending on whether they were being chewed by caterpillars or pierced by aphids, tailoring their chemical response to the specific threat. It is as though each plant carries a distributed intelligence, not concentrated in one place, but shared through every fiber of its being. The roots, especially, seem to act as explorers and communicators. They navigate soil with remarkable precision, choosing paths that maximize access to nutrients and moisture. When two roots from the same plant encounter one another, they cooperate. When they meet roots from a competitor, they change course, sometimes even releasing chemicals to deter the intruder. Researchers at the University of Florence, working under Stefano Mancuso, have demonstrated that roots can sense gravity, touch, sound, and even faint electrical fields. Mancuso describes them as a swarm intelligence, each tip processing information and sharing it through the plant's vascular system. If an obstacle appears, the plant redirects growth collectively, in much the same way a flock of birds turns in unison or an ant colony adapts to a blocked path. This view of the plant as a networked organism has begun to change how scientists think about consciousness itself. Awareness, it seems, may not depend on having a brain, but on the capacity to register information, store it, and act upon it. In this sense, a forest might be seen as an even greater mind, a vast connected web where each tree communicates with others through the soil, fungi, and air. Studies of mycorrhizal networks, sometimes called the Wood Wide Web, show that older trees, the so-called mother trees, can recognize and nourish their kin, sending more carbon and nitrogen through the underground fungal threads to related seedlings. When one tree is damaged, others nearby alter their chemistry in response, so the signal of distress had been understood. If awareness exists as pattern rather than organ, then the plant world may represent the oldest and most enduring example of it. Unlike animal intelligence, which depends on motion and speed, plant intelligence is rooted in stillness and time. The tree does not flee from harm or chase opportunity. It adjusts its chemistry, its direction, its rhythm. It is a form of cognition that measures time not in moments, but in seasons, one that acts through patience rather than impulse. To accept that plants think, even in a way alien to us, is to expand our idea of what life is capable of. It means recognizing that awareness might not be a privilege of mobility or complexity, but a quality woven into matter itself, emerging wherever energy meets sensitivity. The plant mind does not dream or speak, yet it perceives and remembers, holding knowledge in the language of growth. And when the wind moves through a field, when roots trace invisible paths through the dark, it may be that we are witnessing thought itself, so slow, so silent, and so vast that it has surrounded us all along. Long before history began to be written, before kings and cities and calendars, the earth was ruled by grass. The great plains that stretched across continents were covered in waves of it wild barley, wheat, millet, rice, sorghum, each species shifting with wind and weather, each seed containing within it a small, durable promise of energy. For hundreds of thousands of years, human beings wandered through these landscapes as hunters and gatherers, taking what they could find and moving on. But somewhere between 10 and 12,000 years ago, near the banks of rivers that still bear witness to civilization's birth, the Tigris and the Euphrates, the Nile, the Indus, the Yellow River, a quiet revolution began. People stopped following food and began growing it. They learned to save seeds from one season to the next, to shape the earth with water and tools, and in doing so, they entered into a partnership that would transform both sides forever. It was not man who tamed plants, as we like to believe, but rather plants that tamed us, drawing us into their cycles of growth, harvest, and renewal until our entire world revolved around them. Archaeologists call this moment the Neolithic Revolution, but it might be more accurate to call it the Green Revolution, the first one. Long before the modern age borrowed the term, its origins can be traced to the Fertile Crescent around 9,500 BCE, where wild anchored wheat and barley grew in abundance along stony hillsides. Early farmers began selecting the seeds that clung to their stalks rather than shattering in the wind, unknowingly favoring mutations that made the plants dependent on human hands for spreading. These were the first domestic species shaped by attention and labor into forms that could no longer survive alone. In return, they offered abundance. A single acre of cultivated wheat could feed hundreds more people than the same land used for hunting or gathering. Villages grew, then towns, and by 4000 BCE, great cities like Uruk and Eridu rose from the plains of Mesopotamia, built upon grain. The same story unfolded independently in other corners of the world, as if the planet itself had whispered the same idea into different ears. In China, along the valleys of the Yangtze and Yellow Rivers, early farmers began planting rice, a crop that required water, patience, and precision. They learned to flood fields at the perfect depth, to transplant seedlings by hand, to harvest, with blades fine enough not to waste a grain. In Mesoamerica, around 7000 BCE, the wild grass teosinte was coaxed into maize. Its kernels, once hard and sparse, transformed through generations of selection into the golden ears that would one day feed empires. In the Andes, people cultivated potatoes and quinoa. In Africa, sorghum and yams. Everywhere the same pattern emerged. Plants that had once lived wild alongside us began to draw us near, turning our movement into settlement, our foraging into planning, our memory into calendar. It is easy to think of agriculture as a human invention. But in truth it was a negotiation, a slow and subtle exchange of needs. The plants gave sustenance, and in return we gave them space, protection, and propagation. Wheat, rice, and maize are the true rulers of history, shaping where people settled, how they worshipped, and what they fought for. Empires rose around. Their cultivation, the floodplains of Egypt, bound to the rhythm of the Nile's waters and its annual sowing of grain. The Roman Empire built on wheat from Sicily and North Africa. The dynasties of China sustained by rice terraces carved into mountainsides. The civilizations of the Maya and Aztec bound to maize, which they called our mother in our flesh. These plants were not just food, they were identity, wealth, and survival. When they failed, as during the droughts that brought down the Akkadian Empire around 2200 BCE, or the rice famines that shook China's Qing dynasty in the 19th century, entire worlds unraveled. Every city that has ever existed is at its root an agreement between humans and plants. The bricks and towers may belong to us, but the foundation belongs to them. Grain determined the boundaries of power, dictated the seasons of labor, and shaped the very architecture of civilization. The first written records, the cuneiform tablets of Sumer, are not poems or prayers, but ledgers lists of barley rations, harvest counts, and temple storage inventories. Writing itself, it seems, was born from the need to remember grain. Temples became granaries, priests became accountants of the harvest, and kings rose as guardians of irrigation and distribution. Where water flowed, grain followed, and where grain followed, people gathered. Civilization was not built by conquest first, but by cultivation. Over time, our relationship with these plants deepened into dependence. We carried them wherever we went, and they carried our history in their seeds. When European explorers crossed oceans in the 15th and 16th centuries, they brought with them wheat and rice, introducing them to new continents, while taking back maize and potatoes that would reshape the old world. Ireland's population would one day depend on a single Andean tuber. China's population would triple after maize and sweet potatoes reached its hills. North America's plains would turn golden with wheat brought from Ukraine. The plants had become global travelers, spreading through ships and soil, binding continents together in a living web of trade and cultivation. Yet beneath this grand expansion lies a quieter truth. The partnership that began in ancient fields has never been equal. We like to imagine ourselves as the masters of agriculture, the ones who plant, prune, and harvest by choice. But our cities, our economies, and even our bodies reveal a deeper servitude. Our calendars still follow the rhythm of sowing and reaping. Our wealth rises and falls with harvests. Our diets trace back to those few ancient species. We have shaped them, yes, but they have shaped us far more. Even the myths of gods in creation carry their imprint. Demeter and Osiris, Ceres and Inari, deities born from grain and fertility, worshipped as both mothers and sustenance. In the quiet of an empty field after harvest, the story of that long negotiation still lingers. The soil remembers every plow, every seed, every hand that once bent over it. The revolution that began with the first sprouting grains never truly ended it, only changed form. We are still living inside it, still bound by its cycles, still breathing the same agreement our ancestors made when they chose to settle beside their crops. In the end, civilization itself is not a monument of stone, but a garden that never stopped growing. A living record of our shared history with the green world that made us human in the 19th century, when emotions were often considered too dangerous to speak aloud, when propriety demanded silence, where the heart demanded expression. People found another way to communicate through flowers. In parlors filled with gaslight and perfume, in gardens bordered by iron and ivy, a quiet language took root. One made not of words, but of petals, colors, and arrangements. A bouquet could confess what a mouth could not. A single bloom could end a friendship, begin a courtship, or carry a warning across the drawing rooms of London, Paris, or St. Petersburg. It was called floriography, the language of flowers, and for a few decades it became one of the strangest and most beautiful codes humanity ever invented. A system where every plant had a meaning, every stem a sentence, and every gift a message waiting to be deciphered. The roots of this floral language stretch far deeper than the Victorian age. In ancient Persia, lovers sent each other blooms as secret messages. While in Japan, the practice of hanakoda, assigning emotion to flowers, had already evolved by the 17th century into a refined art. But it was during the early 1800s, after the travels of Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, the wife of a British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, that the idea began to spread across Europe. In letters sent home from Constantinople, she described the Turkish custom of using flowers and objects to convey coded messages. Her accounts, half travelogue and half confession, fascinated the polite world of England, which was hungry for exotic ideas yet bound by strict social decorum. Within a few decades, books began appearing with titles like The Language of Flowers or Le Langage des Fleurs, each attempting to standardize what different blooms were supposed to mean. The first English edition, published in 1819 and attributed to an anonymous author under the pseudonym Charlotte de la Tour, became a sensation. By mid-century, the practice had grown into a full social ritual. Young women learned floral vocabulary as carefully as they did French or piano, and calling cards were often accompanied by sprigs of symbolic plants. A red rose meant love, of course, but a yellow one could mean jealousy or friendship depending on who received it. A violet signified modesty, and a lily, purity, a forget-me-not, remembrance, a daisy, innocence, and a marigold, grief or cruelty. The meanings were not fixed, different books disagreed, but that was part of the charm. Every exchange carried uncertainty, every bouquet a mystery to be unraveled. Whole conversations unfolded in garden paths and conservatories without a single word spoken, the language of petals understood by those who could not otherwise speak freely. But this floral code was not confined to romance. In times of censorship and political unrest, flowers became vehicles for rebellion and allegiance. During the revolutions that swept Europe in 1848, certain colors and species took on patriotic meanings. In France, red carnations were worn by radicals as symbols of courage and resistance. In Poland, violets became emblems of solidarity under Russian rule. Even earlier, during the Napoleonic Wars, the white lily-long, a symbol of the French monarchy, was banned in public displays, while the tricolor arrangements of blue cornflowers, white daisies, and red poppies quietly proclaimed loyalty to the Republic. In Russia, during the late 19th century, red flowers were often placed discreetly on graves of political martyrs, their meaning clear to those who knew how to read them. Flowers became a secret script that crossed borders, spoken by those who lived under watchful eyes. In Victorian England, where restraint governed almost every gesture, the bouquet was both an escape and a performance. A suitor might send a posy of pink camellias, meaning longing for you, or white heather, and meaning good luck, and await a reply delivered not by letter but by return bouquet. To hand back yellow carnations meant rejection. To add ferns was to say, I am sincere. Even the manner of presentation mattered. A flower held upright signaled agreement. Inverted meant refusal. For funerals, wreaths became complex compositions of meaning. The laurel for victory over death, cypress. For mourning, ivy for eternal friendship. The ritual gave structure to emotions that society demanded be hidden, transforming grief and affection alike into symbols that could be held, displayed and understood without shame. The language of flowers was also a way of preserving memory. Pressed into diaries, tucked inside letters, or sealed beneath glass and lockets, flowers became keepsakes of feeling. The Victorians were obsessed with collecting and preserving, and the herbarium, a book of pressed specimens, became both a scientific and emotional archive. A sprig of lavender could remind its keeper of a summer visit, a faded rose of a lost love. Queen Victoria herself exchanged floral messages with Prince Albert, and after his death in 1861, she kept bouquets from their anniversaries carefully, preserved for decades, each one labeled with dates and meanings. The practice spread across classes and continents, reaching even the far edges of empire. In India, British women sent each other coded posies to share homesickness or gossip. In the American South, Confederate widows wove garlands of magnolia and white rose for remembrance. But like many languages, the floral code eventually faded. By the early 20th century, industrialization and modern communication made its subtleties seem outdated. Telephones, telegrams, and public speech replaced secret symbols. Yet the remnants of that era lingered in phrases that survived the centuries too, where a rose for love, to offer an olive branch for peace, to plant a lily for mourning. The symbolism of flowers, once a private dialect, seeped into the cultural bloodstream until it became instinct. Even now, without realizing it, speak the old language when we lay chrysanthemums on graves or give roses on Valentine's Day. In a sense, the Victorians did not invent meaning in flowers. They merely uncovered what had always been there. Across all human history, petals and stems have stood for more than themselves. They carry the seasons of memory, the gestures that language cannot hold. Every culture has felt the need to give emotion a body. And in the flower's fragile form, people found the perfect vessel, something alive, temporary, and luminous enough to bear the weight of unspoken truth. Even today, when the world moves too fast for secret codes, a bouquet still carries an echo of that hidden grammar. Behind its beauty lies the same quiet message that once passed hand to hand beneath the gaze of watchful society, that some feelings, no matter how carefully they are arranged, can only be understood in the silence between two hearts. High in the white mountains of California, where the air thins and the rocks crumble beneath the weight of centuries, there stands a forest unlike any other on earth. The trunks are twisted, gnarled, and bleached by wind, their bark peeling away in ribbons of amber and silver. These are bristlecone pines, among the oldest living beings on the planet. Some have stood in that same soil for nearly 5,000 years, older than the pyramids of Egypt, older than the first alphabet, older than every name we have given to time. They live where few others can, on dry slopes between 9 and 11. 1,000 feet above sea level, where storms scour the ground and snow lingers long into summer. Yet it is this harshness that has preserved them, slowing their growth to almost nothing. Each ring of wood no thicker than a fingernail each year, marked in silence. To stand among them is to feel something close to eternity, at the eternity of gods or myths, but of patience, endurance, and quiet defiance against decay. The oldest of them all, known as Methuselah, grows somewhere in the Inyo National Forest. Its exact location is kept secret to protect it from damage or theft, but dendrochronologists dated it to around 4,850 years old, meaning it began life around 2,830 BCE, when the great cities of Mesopotamia were still new and the pyramids of Giza had not yet seen completion, or something almost unsettling about its presence. Its trunk, half dead and half alive, seems carved by centuries of wind and the living tissue that remains. A narrow strip of bark spiraling up its side, still, produces new needles every few years. When scientists took core samples from trees nearby, they discovered that the forest as a whole holds a record of nearly 9,000 years of climate history preserved in wood grain, the droughts, the rains, the volcanic eruptions, all recorded in the alternating thickness of its rings. These trees have watched glaciers retreat, civilizations rise, and empires fall. And still they endure, unhurried, untouched by the drama that unfolds beneath them. Far to the east, in the mountains of Utah, lies another kind of ancient life, not singular, but collective, there in the Fish Lake National Forest. An aspen grove known as Pando, Latin for ice spread, covers more than 100 acres. At first glance, it looks like a normal forest, thousands of slender trunks shimmering in the wind, their leaves flickering with the sound of paper. But beneath the surface, all those trunks share one root system, one continuous organism estimated to weigh over 6,000 tons and to be nearly 10,000 years old. Each tree you see above ground is only a shoot, a temporary expression of the larger being below. When one trunk dies, others rise in its place, all connected through living roots that never stop growing. To walk through Pando is to walk through time itself, to move across generations that are all one life, a single mind spread across space and centuries. Scientists studying its genetic makeup have found that every stem, no matter how distant, carries identical DNA of family that has never separated since the last Ice Age. These living ancients challenge the way humans measure existence, our lifetimes. Even the longest of them are brief sparks against such duration. Nations rise, languages evolve, wars rage and end. And still the bristlecone pine clings to its ridge, the aspen grove renews its leaves. Their constancy forces a different scale of thought, one in which change becomes almost irrelevant. For these beings, time is not a river, but a slow tide, flowing and returning endlessly. The death of a branch or a trunk means nothing when the root or the heart remains intact. They endure not by resisting decay, but by accepting it, incorporating it into their own survival. The dead wood of the bristlecone hardens into stone, protecting what is still alive within, while the fallen trunks of the aspen feed the soil that sustains their living kin. Their immortality is not the absence of death, but the mastery of it. It is perhaps inevitable that humans, restless and aware of their own brevity, should look upon such life with a kind of reverence. Ancient trees have always drawn our imagination toward the divine. The Greeks spoke of sacred oaks where oracles whispered the will of the gods. The Norse imagined Yggdrasil, the world tree that connected heaven, earth, and the underworld, its roots drinking from the wells of wisdom and destiny. In Asia, the Bodhi tree beneath which Siddhartha Gautama achieved enlightenment became a living symbol of spiritual awakening, and its descendants are still tended in temples across Sri Lanka and India. Even in the modern world, where science has replaced much of myth, the impulse remains. Visitors who travel to see the Methuselah Grove often speak of feeling hushed, as if entering a cathedral made of wood and wind rather than stone and silence. In the shade of such age, human noise seems trivial, even indecent. What fascinates us most about these organisms is that they have found a way to stretch life beyond the boundaries we accept as natural. They do not conquer time, yet they refuse to be hurried by it. Their strategy is simplicity itself, to grow slowly, to waste nothing, to keep part of themselves asleep while the rest endures. Scientists studying the molecular biology of bristlecones have found that they maintain extraordinary control over decay, producing protective compounds that prevent fungi and bacteria from taking hold. Their wood is dense with resin that repels insects and resists rot. Result is a form of biological neuromortality, achieved not through vigor or abundance but through restraint. The tree survives because it does less, because it measures every act of growth against the weight of centuries. There is a kind of humility in that endurance, a reminder that permanence is not achieved through struggle, but through balance.
Oh.
Trees do not fight the elements, they lean with them. They do not chase the seasons, they wait for them. And in their waiting, they have become mirrors for our own longing to remain. Every culture that has ever stood in the presence of such age has turned it into a story about ourselves, about how we might live longer, wiser, or more gently. We project onto them the dream of immortality, the hope that something of us might last as they do. Yet the truth they offer is quieter and far more profound. Immortality is not endless life, but continual renewal. The passing of energy and memory from one form to another, the way a root sends forth new shoots long after the first stem has fallen. Standing before an ancient tree, one cannot help but feel that time itself has paused. Holding its breath around this living monument, its bark carries the texture of wind and frost. Its rings hold the history of seasons long forgotten. In their presence, the boundaries between past and present seem to dissolve. And what remains is something older than both, is stillness that endures beyond reckoning. To those who listen, these trees seem to whisper not of eternity as we imagine it, but of endurance, patience, and the slow understanding that to live long is to live wisely, to take only what one must, and to leave behind what others may continue. In the silent groves of the bristlecone, in the trembling light of the aspen, the dream of immortality is already fulfilled, not through defiance of death, but through perfect harmony with time. Somewhere between the rise of the tide and the turn of dawn, a single breath leaves a forest and begins its journey. It moves invisibly, born from the slow green labor of leaves, carrying within it the memory of sunlight. This breath drifts across mountains and cities, crosses oceans, and eventually finds its way into a human chest, where it becomes something else, life renewed through motion, light transformed into being. The air we breathe is not our own. Is shared, ancient, unbroken. Every inhale we take contains traces of everything that has ever lived. The exhalation of a whale beneath the Arctic ice, the breath of a pine standing in a storm, the sigh of a fern that opened on the floor of a Devonian forest 400 million years ago. In every molecule of oxygen there is history, not of individuals, but of exchange, a rhythm that binds everything alive into one slow, endless conversation between leaf and lung. The act of breathing feels simple, almost invisible in its repetition. And yet it connects us to the planet in a way that is more intimate than touch. Every inhalation draws in the work of plants, algae, and cyanobacteria that labor silently across the surface of the earth. The forests of the Amazon and Congo, the kelp beds of the Pacific, the plankton blooms of the Southern Ocean, all of them take the raw light of the sun and the still air of carbon dioxide, and through photosynthesis, give us breath. Scientists estimate that half of all the oxygen in our atmosphere comes not from trees, but from the ocean, from microscopic phytoplankton, drifting near the surface, each one no larger than a speck of dust, yet together producing more air than all the world's forests combined. The other half comes from the land, from the green architecture of plants that inhale what we exhale, binding us together in an endless exchange. When we breathe, we are taking part in the same cycle that began when life first learned to draw. Energy from light, it is easy to forget this connection in the hum of daily life, surrounded by walls and engines. But the balance remains, quiet and absolute. Every human breath sends carbon back into the atmosphere, where it waits to be claimed again by a leaf, a blade of grass, or a drifting algal bloom. In this way, we are never separate from the world that made us. We are part of its respiration. The poet Ralph Waldo Emerson once wrote that the earth laughs in flowers, but it also breathes in us. Even our most private moments sleep, sigh, laughter, are borrowed acts of planetary rhythm, our lungs echoing the slow expansion and contraction of forests and seas. If one could watch this exchange from afar, from the vantage of a satellite orbiting hundreds of miles above, the planet would appear to pulse. During spring and summer, the great northern continents flush green, drawing carbon from the air as plants awaken and bloom. In autumn and winter, the color fades and the balance reverses, releasing what was stored. It is a heartbeat measured in seasons, a visible reminder that the planet is alive, breathing through all of us. NASA scientists call this the Earth's biospheric respiration, and it is recorded in data as a gentle wave, a rise and fall of gases that mirrors the turning of the year. Yet behind the data lies something older than measurement, something that feels almost sacred. The sense that life, in all its forms, is engaged in the same steady rhythm of giving and taking, of inhaling and exhaling. Across time and space, when we die, our breath does not end. It simply changes direction. Carbon in our bodies dissolves into soil, rivers, and air, feeding the roots of other living things. The oxygen we once used returns to the cycle, rejoining the invisible chorus of gases that drift between ocean and cloud. In this way, nothing is lost. The air that filled the lungs of a Roman farmer or a Cretaceous bird may well pass through us today, reshaped but unbroken. Scientists who study atmospheric chemistry can trace this continuity through isotopes, noting that the oxygen we breathe carries a chemical fingerprint that connects it directly to the photosynthetic life that made it. We are quite literally breathing the memory of the Earth. This continuity has a quiet spirituality to it, one that transcends language or belief. Across cultures, breath has long been equated with spirit, pneuma in Greek, ruach in Hebrew, prana in Sanskrit, the unseen energy that animates the living. Ancient people may not have known the chemistry. They understood the truth, that to breathe is to participate in something larger than oneself. When we exhale, the forests inhale. When they exhale, we live. It is a dialogue without beginning or end, and in its constancy lies a kind of mercy. No matter how far we distance ourselves from nature, the bond remains, woven into every breath. Perhaps this is the real secret of the planet, the quiet unity that exists beneath all divisions. We live surrounded by the evidence of separation. Cities built on stone, roads cut through earth, boundaries drawn on maps. Yet none of these barriers can divide the air. It moves freely, carrying pollen, spores, salt, and song. It travels from desert to sea, from tundra to tropic, reminding us that the smallest act of breathing links us to every living thing. The same molecule of oxygen may touch the lungs of a whale, the leaf of a birch, and the chest of a sleeping child, completing a cycle that has no owner and no center. If the planet could dream, perhaps its dream would be of balance, single, patient breath that flows through every creature, every field, every wave. To see the world this way is to realize that we are not guests upon it, but parts of it, made of its air, its minerals, its light. The forests that give us breath are not distant. They are extensions of our own lungs, are not separate from our veins. Their salt and ours are the same. Life in the end is not a hierarchy, but a garden, one vast, patient garden that remembers everything it has ever grown. And so, as the cycle closes, the breath returns. The air we take in tonight may have been born in a field of seagrass or released from the canopy of the Amazon at dawn. It will leave us changed, and yet it will continue on, drawn back into the endless exchange that began long before the first human drew breath. To live is to borrow, to give back, to be part of that unbroken pattern of renewal. The planet does not keep our names, but it keeps our breath, folded into its slow, eternal respiration, whispering through the trees and the waves that once carried us and will carry us again.